It started with a series of strange calendar alerts. They'd pop up on my phone without warning, even though I hadn't set them. The first one appeared on a random Tuesday afternoon as I was sitting at my desk at work. My phone vibrated, and I looked down to see a notification from my calendar app. Appointment at 3 p.m. Prepare. I blinked, staring at the screen, confused. I hadn't scheduled anything. I opened the app to delete the entry, but there was nothing there. No appointment listed. Just an empty calendar. I brushed it off, figured it was a glitch, but over the next week, the alerts kept coming. Sometimes they were simple, like "don't forget." Other times, they were longer, cryptic reminders like "see clearly today" or "you're almost ready." Each one would vanish as soon as I opened the app to delete it. I started taking screenshots just to prove to myself they were real. But the messages started to get personal. I'd be out for a walk, clearing my head after work, and suddenly my phone would buzz with a reminder saying, "Notice the red door on Main Street," or "you know the house. Look closer." Once, as I walked past a coffee shop near my apartment, my phone buzzed with an alert that simply said, "Don't turn around." I froze. My whole body tensed, and I felt the fine hairs on my neck rise. I had this sudden, overpowering sensation that someone was watching me, that if I turned, I'd see something I couldn't unsee. I kept walking, feeling my heart hammering, not daring to look back until I was back in my apartment. Then, about 2 weeks after the alerts began, they started changing. Instead of short reminders, I'd get full instructions. Commands, really. The first one hit at 11:11 p.m. on a Thursday night, just as I was lying in bed, trying to drift off to sleep. My phone lit up with an alert. Stand in front of the mirror. I stared at the message, my stomach twisting. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to turn off my phone and pretend none of this was happening, but another part felt compelled, almost like I had no choice. Against every logical thought, I got up and went to the bathroom, standing in front of the mirror, feeling ridiculous and a little unnerved. My phone buzzed again, and this time the alert read, "Smile." I didn't want to. It felt stupid, pointless, creepy even, but some part of me, a strange, intrusive curiosity, pushed me to do it. I forced a smile, watching myself in the mirror, and as I stared, something strange happened. My reflection didn't look like mine anymore. The eyes seemed a little too intense, the smile too wide, as though there was something else behind my face, peering out from beneath the surface. I quickly looked away, turning off my phone and hurrying back to bed, my skin prickling with dread. The next few days passed quietly, with no alerts, no strange instructions. Just a tense silence, as though something were waiting. I almost started to think it was over, that maybe it had all just been a glitch in the app. But then, on a Monday morning, just as I was getting ready for work, a new alert appeared. "Take the bus today. Sit in the last row." I usually drove, but the command made my skin crawl. It was specific, deliberate, and I felt an instinctive urge to ignore it. But as I reached for my keys, another alert buzzed onto my phone. This one a single, stark word. "Now!" My hand froze, and before I realized what I was doing, I was locking the door, heading out to the bus stop, a strange numbness filling my mind. I boarded the bus, found the last row, and sat down, staring at the back of the seat in front of me, feeling the world around me blur, almost dreamlike. For a while, nothing happened. I felt my mind wander, my eyes unfocused, as the city passed by outside the window. Then my phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. "Look left." I turned my head slowly, almost as though someone else were moving it for me. And that's when I saw him. A man, sitting 2 rows up, staring directly at me. He wore a gray jacket, his face sharp, almost gaunt, with hollow eyes that looked too wide, too intense. The moment our eyes met, he smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that made my skin crawl. My phone buzzed with another alert. "Do not look away." I wanted to turn, to get up, to leave, but my body felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The man kept staring, his eyes unblinking, his smile stretching wider, like he knew something I didn't, like he was in on some horrible secret. Finally, the bus reached my stop. I practically jumped up, stumbling off the bus, my heart racing as I hurried down the street, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting him to follow. But the street was empty. I made it to my office, feeling rattled, unable to shake the image of his face, that awful smile. That night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed one last time. He knows now. The word sent a chill through me. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, get rid of it, but it was too late. I knew that whatever game I was caught in, I couldn't escape. The alert stopped after that. For a full week, nothing happened. But every day, I felt that gnawing sensation in the back of my mind, that feeling that I was being watched. I'd see that man's face everywhere, in reflections, in the corner of my vision, even in my dreams. I tried to ignore it, to live normally, but I knew he was there, somewhere close, waiting. Then, last night, my phone lit up one final time with a single alert. Look outside. My hands were shaking as I got out of bed and went to the window. The street was dark and quiet, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp. But then I saw him, standing on the sidewalk, staring up at my apartment. He didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there, waiting, his face half hidden in shadow, but I could see that same twisted smile, that hungry, hollow gaze. I stumbled back, my mind racing, and in that instant, my phone buzzed again. Let him in. The words burned into my brain, and I felt my body move on its own, as though I were a puppet. I walked toward the door, hand reaching for the lock, my mind screaming to stop, to turn around, but my body wouldn't obey. And then, in one brief flash of clarity, I broke free. I stopped, stumbling back from the door, gasping, feeling like I just escaped from drowning. I looked at my phone, heart pounding, expecting another message, but the screen was dark. I turned off my phone, buried it under a pile of clothes in my closet, and sat in silence, my back pressed against the door, listening to the empty stillness of the apartment. Now it's been a day, and the phone hasn't buzzed again. The alerts have stopped, but every time I close my eyes, I see him, waiting outside, smiling, patient, as if he knows that eventually I'll have to let him in. And in the quiet, I swear I can still hear that faint, familiar vibration, a sound I now recognize as more than just an alert. It's a pulse. When I first saw the house, I was driving back from a work trip through a series of winding, rural roads that my GPS insisted was a shortcut. It was late, nearly midnight, and my headlights carved pale tunnels through the dark forest that seemed to go on forever. Then, out of nowhere, my car started sputtering, and within seconds, it died completely. I coasted to a stop, cursing my luck as I flipped through my phone for a signal. Nothing. No bars, no towns nearby, just trees pressing in on both sides of the road. After a few futile attempts to start the car, I got out to pop the hood. I stood there in the dark, shining my flashlight over the engine like I knew what I was looking for when I saw it. Up ahead, on a slight hill set back from the road, there was a house. A big one, its windows glowing faintly through the trees. I felt a wave of relief. If I could just make it up there, maybe they'd have a phone I could use, or at the very least, they might let me stay until morning. Grabbing my bag, I started up the path, the sound of crickets and distant owls breaking the silence. The closer I got, the stranger the house looked. It was an old Victorian, the kind with peeling paint and an ornate front porch, but what struck me was that it looked oddly well kept. Fresh paint on the shutters, pristine hedges, and not a single broken step on the porch. It was like stepping into a photograph from 100 years ago, everything perfectly preserved. I knocked on the door and waited, glancing around. The house was eerily quiet, almost too still, like the entire place was holding its breath. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and a tall man in an old-fashioned suit stood there, looking at me with an expression of mild surprise. "Good evening," he said, his voice deep and calm. "You seem lost." I quickly explained my car trouble, and he nodded thoughtfully before stepping aside and gesturing for me to come in. "You're welcome to use the phone, of course," he said, leading me into the foyer. The inside of the house was just as pristine as the outside. Richly colored wallpaper, antique furniture, even the faint scent of lavender hanging in the air. It felt more like a museum than a home. As I followed him, I noticed several other people gathered in a parlor just off the hallway. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing. 2 suits, dresses, hats, like they were attending a party from a different era. They all turned to look at me when I passed, their faces polite but expressionless, like they were waiting for something. I offered an awkward nod, feeling suddenly self-conscious in my jeans and windbreaker. The man led me to an old rotary phone in the hallway, one of those bulky, black models with the circular dial. I picked up the receiver, expecting to hear a dial tone, but there was nothing, just dead silence. I jiggled the hook a few times, but still nothing. The man watched me with a calm, almost amused expression. "Unfortunately, the lines are a bit temperamental here," he said, his tone almost apologetic. "But you're welcome to stay until morning. I'm sure we can find you some suitable arrangements." I glanced at the group in the parlor, feeling an odd mixture of discomfort and curiosity. "Are you having a party?" The man smiled, his teeth perfectly white. "Something like that," he said. "Why don't you join us?" I hesitated, but it was late, and I didn't relish the idea of going back out to my dead car in the middle of nowhere. So I nodded and followed him into the parlor, where the others greeted me with stiff, formal nods. They all watched me as I sat down, their eyes lingering just a little too long, their expressions polite but distant, like I was an unexpected guest at a family gathering. As I settled into one of the armchairs, I noticed something odd about the room. There were no clocks, no ticking, no chiming, nothing to mark the time. The windows were covered with heavy drapes, blocking out any view of the outside, and the only light came from a pair of gas lamps on the wall, casting a warm, flickering glow. One of the women leaned toward me, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. "Are you from around here?" she asked, her voice soft and lilting. "No, just passing through," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. "My car broke down." The others nodded, murmuring in polite sympathy, but there was something about their expressions that made me feel uneasy. They all looked similar, in a way I couldn't quite place. Their skin was pale, almost waxy, their eyes just a little too bright, like dolls left too long in a dusty attic. The man who'd let me in offered me a glass of what looked like brandy. "To ease your nerves," he said with a faint smile. I accepted it, taking a sip, but the drink tasted strange, thick, almost syrupy, with a metallic aftertaste. I set it down, feeling a wave of nausea creep over me, but I forced myself to smile, trying to ignore the prickle of unease crawling up my spine. As the night wore on, the guests continued to talk, sharing stories about people and places I'd never heard of, each tale more peculiar than the last. They spoke of events from decades ago, as if they'd happened yesterday. A summer festival in 1912, a fire that had burned down the town hall in 1937, a wedding that had taken place just last month in 1945. At first, I thought they were joking, but their faces were deadly serious, their eyes distant, as if reliving memories from another lifetime. I checked my watch, trying to gauge how late it was, but the hand seemed stuck, frozen at midnight. I tapped the face, frowning, and one of the guests, a woman with a tight bun and an old-fashioned lace collar, noticed. "Tom doesn't work quite the same way here," she said, her smile thin and strange. "Once you arrive, you might say it stops." I laughed nervously, assuming she was just playing along with the eerie atmosphere, but no one else joined in. They were all staring at me, their expressions unreadable, and the room suddenly felt colder, the air heavy with something I couldn't name. I excused myself, muttering something about needing to check my car, but as I turned to leave, I realized that the doorway was gone. Where there had been an open arch leading back to the hall, there was now only a solid wall, the wallpaper seamless, as if there had never been a door there at all. I turned back to the guests, my pulse racing. "Where's the door?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man who had let me in smiled, his face calm, almost sympathetic. "You can leave in the morning," he said softly. "There's no need to rush." I backed away, my heart pounding as I looked around, searching for any way out, but the room was sealed, closed off like a tomb. The others were watching me, their faces serene, their eyes dark and endless. And then, one by one, they started to stand, their movements slow and deliberate, like marionettes being lifted by invisible strings. They formed a loose circle around me, their faces impassive, and the man took a step forward, extending his hand. "Once you're here," he murmured, his voice echoing in the silence, "you belong." I stumbled backward, tripping over the armchair, my hands clawing at the walls as I searched for an exit, but there was none. The others closed in, their faces blank and unfeeling, their eyes cold and dark, like pits that led to some place beyond reason, beyond time. And as the gaslight flickered and dimmed, the room seemed to stretch, the walls pulling away into darkness, and I realized with a sickening clarity that I was trapped, not just in the house, but in some twisted version of it. A place where time had lost its grip, where faces never aged, where doors led nowhere. In the end, I don't remember what happened. I remember the darkness, the sound of my own breathing, the way the walls seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. And then nothing. Now, when travelers pass through that lonely stretch of road, they sometimes see a faint light on the hill, a warm glow shining through the trees. And if they get close enough, they'll see a figure standing at the window, watching, waiting. But no one ever seems to leave. It started on a quiet Tuesday morning at the library. I work there part-time, shelving books in the back corner where it's always a bit dim, the lights flickering just enough to give the place an eerie feel. I'd been on shift for a few hours when I noticed him, a tall man with a faded baseball cap, standing just beyond the nearest row of bookshelves. He wasn't browsing, wasn't reading. He was just standing there staring at me. I tried to ignore it at first. People drift in and out all the time. Sometimes they space out or lose themselves among the shelves. But every time I turned around to grab another book from my cart, there he was, eyes fixed on me through the gaps between the books. The way he watched, head tilted slightly, was unsettling, as if he were studying me rather than just looking. I felt a chill crawl up my spine and decided to take a break up front, hoping he'd be gone when I returned. I waited at the front desk, chatting briefly with my coworker, pretending to be busy with some paperwork. When I finally went back to my cart, he was gone. I let out a sigh of relief, chalking it up to my imagination, and pushed it from my mind. But that was just the beginning. The next morning, he was there again. This time, he was sitting at a table near the back, a newspaper open in front of him, though he never once turned a page. Every time I glanced his way, he was looking over the paper at me, his eyes sharp and unblinking, like he was waiting for something. I pretended not to notice, but I could feel his gaze following me as I moved up and down the rows, checking book spines and running my fingers over the shelves. A few days went by, and his visits became routine. I'd arrive at work, and there he'd be, waiting in some hidden nook, watching as I moved through the stacks. He never checked out any books, never spoke to anyone, just observed, eyes dark and intent, always finding some new place to linger where he'd go unnoticed unless you knew to look. One evening, just as I was closing up, I heard footsteps echoing in the empty rows. The library had closed nearly an hour ago, and I was the only one left on shift. Heart pounding, I grabbed my keys and walked toward the sound, trying to stay calm. I glanced down the aisle, but there was no one there. The rows of books stretched out, silent and still, shadows pooling in the corners. I locked up and headed home, brushing it off as paranoia. But a few hours later, I got a text from an unknown number. "Did you hear me?" A knot of fear tightened in my stomach. I stared at the screen, fingers trembling. I wanted to believe it was a prank, but something in my gut told me it wasn't. I blocked the number, trying to shake it off, though sleep didn't come easily that night. The next week, things got worse. I started seeing him everywhere, across the street from my building, waiting near my bus stop, even at the grocery store, his eyes following me from behind a stack of cereal boxes. His face was always partially hidden by a hat, a scarf, the angle of a shelf, but I knew it was him. I could feel it in the way his presence pressed down on me, thick and heavy, impossible to ignore. One night, I came home to find a small book sitting outside my door. It was an old, dusty novel, one we used to keep in the library's back corner until it had been weeded out and discarded a few months ago. Inside, there was a note in neat, cramped handwriting. "I know what you read. I know where you sit. I know when you're alone." I locked my door, heart hammering, and called my boss the next morning, explaining the situation and asking if we had any footage from the security cameras outside the building. She looked concerned but told me the cameras were more of a deterrent. There weren't any actual recordings, just empty boxes bolted to the walls to keep people from stealing the library's Wi-Fi routers. That night, I tried to relax, but my apartment felt suffocatingly small, every corner filled with shadows that seemed to press in closer. I found myself glancing out the windows every few minutes, half expecting to see him standing on the street below, watching. And then, one night, he came closer. It was around midnight when I heard a scraping noise outside my door, like someone running something sharp along the wood. I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise stopped, and I crept closer, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might give me away. Slowly, I peered through the peephole, and there he was, standing inches from the door, his face partially obscured by the shadows, one eye staring directly into the lens. He raised a hand, pressing his fingers against the door, dragging them down slowly. I could hear his nails scraping against the wood, a sound that sent a chill straight down my spine. I wanted to scream, but I was frozen, unable to look away from that dark, piercing gaze. Finally, after what felt like hours, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hall. The next morning, I found a deep scratch on my door, running from top to bottom, as if he'd marked it. The sight of it made me feel sick, a reminder that he could get that close, that he could leave something behind to remind me he was there. I didn't go to work that day. Instead, I started packing, ready to leave town for a few days, hoping some distance would make him lose interest. I told myself he couldn't follow me if I just left, went somewhere he couldn't track. But just as I was leaving, I found another note slipped under my door. "You can't hide. I'll always know." The handwriting was the same as the note in the library book, small and neat, almost clinical. I threw the note away, grabbed my bags, and left, driving hours out of the city, not stopping until I reached a quiet town I'd never been to before. I checked into a small motel on the outskirts, hoping the anonymity would make me feel safe. For the first time in days, I slept deeply, lulled by the faint hum of the heater and the distant sounds of passing cars. But when I woke up, there was another note on the nightstand. "Found you." I froze, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. I had locked the door, bolted it from the inside, but somehow he'd gotten in, left the note, and slipped back out without a trace. I packed my things, checked out of the motel, and drove aimlessly for hours, stopping only when I reached another town, miles from anywhere familiar. I rented a small room, a place without even a name on the sign, and hunkered down, leaving my lights off, curtains drawn, jumping at every sound. It's been 3 days, and I haven't seen him yet, but I know he's out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face, that calm, unblinking stare, the way he always seemed to know exactly where I'd be. I don't know how he's tracking me, how he knows where I am, but I can't shake the feeling that he's close, that he'll find me no matter where I go. The worst part is, I'm beginning to wonder if he's always known me. If this didn't start in the library, but somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere I can't remember. I feel like I'm unraveling, every move, every thought being observed, like he's peeling back the layers of my life, getting closer and closer to something only he understands. I don't know how much longer I can run, or if there's any point in hiding. I don't even know if there's anywhere left to go. I still remember the night I finally saw it all clearly. The sky had opened up and rain was coming down in sheets, thick and heavy, the way it only does in November. I was pacing around my apartment, listening to the drops pound against the windows, wondering where Layla was. We'd had plans to go to a small party at her friend's place, but at the last minute, she'd texted saying she was feeling tired and just wanted to go home and relax alone. I could have accepted that easily enough. She was an introvert, and sometimes crowds just drained her. But something felt wrong. She hadn't called. It was just a text, cold and impersonal, like she was messaging a coworker instead of her boyfriend of 3 years. I knew she'd been pulling back lately, slipping out of our time together in ways I couldn't explain. Her laugh, once easy and constant, now felt guarded, like she was weighing her words before saying anything to me. I tried to shake it off, tell myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't sit still. I grabbed my jacket, stepped out into the rain, and started driving, aimlessly at first, not even sure where I was going. But my mind kept spinning, replaying moments in our relationship that had suddenly taken on a new weight. The last-minute work dinners that seemed to come up more and more, the way she'd taken to putting her phone face down every time she set it on the table. And then I found myself pulling up to her building, parking a little way down, so she wouldn't see me if she happened to look out the window. It was late by then, but I could see the light in her living room window still glowing. I didn't know what I expected to find, or even if I'd go up and knock. I just sat there in the rain, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. Then, as I was about to leave, I saw him. A guy I'd never seen before was standing outside her door, holding a small bag, takeout, maybe, and she opened the door, a warm smile spreading across her face. It was a smile I'd thought was reserved for me, a look that I'd taken for granted as mine alone. And then she leaned in, and he leaned in, and suddenly they were locked in a kiss, the kind that left no room for doubt. I felt a hollow, sort of numbness settle over me. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. I watched as she pulled him inside, the door closing with a quiet finality that echoed in my chest. I don't know how long I sat there in the rain, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. Part of me wanted to run up to her door, bang on it, demand an explanation. But the truth was right there in front of me, and confronting it wouldn't change anything. I drove home in a fog, the streets empty and glistening under the streetlights. My phone buzzed with a text from her saying, "Hope you had fun at the party. Love you. Talk tomorrow." I stared at the screen, at those words that had once felt like a promise, and laughed bitterly. It was strange, almost absurd, to see her acting as if everything was fine, as if she wasn't with someone else at that exact moment, lying to me so easily. The next morning, I decided I wouldn't say anything. At least, not right away. I wanted to see if she'd tell me the truth, if she'd show even a hint of guilt. So when we met for coffee the next day, I played along, pretending nothing had changed. She was bright and cheerful, telling me about her quiet night in, even throwing in some details about a movie she'd watched alone. I watched her closely, studying every expression, every laugh. She was good too good. There wasn't a single slip, not a flicker of shame or hesitation. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it, if the rain and exhaustion had played tricks on me. But no, I knew what I'd seen, and every word out of her mouth only solidified the truth. For the next few weeks, I waited, half expecting her to break, to come clean, to say something that would make it easier to forgive her. But she didn't. She just kept up the charade, planning dates, talking about future trips we'd someday take, filling my head with dreams I knew would never come true. And every day, the weight in my chest grew heavier, until it felt like it might suffocate me. Then, one evening, we were out with a group of friends, and I could see her texting under the table, her face lit up in a way that felt too familiar. She was laughing at something completely oblivious to the rest of us, and I felt a surge of anger so intense I almost spoke up right there. Instead, I got up, excused myself, and walked outside to cool off. I stood in the cold night air, breathing deeply, feeling the sting of betrayal more sharply than I ever had. When she came out to find me a few minutes later, I knew it was time. I looked her in the eyes and, in the calmest voice I could manage, said, "Layla, I saw you with him." Her smile faded, her eyes widening in shock, and for the first time, I saw her defenses crumble. She tried to deny it, to stammer something about a misunderstanding, but the look on her face told me everything. There was no more pretending, no more excuses. The mask had slipped, and I could see her for what she was, a stranger who had worn the face of someone I loved. I didn't need an apology. I didn't want an explanation. I just walked away, leaving her standing there, her voice trailing after me as I disappeared into the night. I didn't look back, didn't let myself feel the heartbreak until I was alone in my apartment, where her scent lingered, a painful reminder of all the lies she'd told. In the weeks that followed, I went through the motions, rebuilding my life piece by piece. I deleted our pictures, boxed up her things, erased every trace of her from my space. Friends offered sympathy, family offered advice, but none of it really helped. It was a pain I had to live with on my own, a quiet ache that dulled over time, but never fully disappeared. Months later, I ran into her by chance at a bookstore. She was with him, laughing, looking relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. She glanced my way and froze, her face paling, but I just gave her a nod and walked away. There was no anger left, no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance that what we'd had was gone. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. Life went on, and eventually I started to feel lighter, like a weight had been lifted from me. I found new routines, new people, new places that held no memories of her. And one day, I realized I was grateful. Not for the lies or the pain, but for the clarity, for the strength I'd found in letting go. I'd loved her deeply, yes, but in the end, I'd found something even more valuable. The freedom to move on, to open myself to something real, something true. I've been picking up shifts at an antique shop downtown for a few weeks. It wasn't your typical thrift store. It had that sort of old-world vibe. Heavy on the atmosphere, dusty Persian rugs, faded oil paintings, old mirrors with their silvering worn away. The place was run by a woman named Edith, a tiny old lady who didn't say much but knew where every single item in the store came from and who had owned it. She'd speak softly, always with this air of mystery, like she was letting you in on some grand secret just by telling you the story of an old desk or a chipped porcelain vase. One evening, right before closing, a man came in. He was tall, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his face partially shadowed by a dark fedora. He carried an item wrapped in cloth, and his eyes never met mine. He handed it to Edith without a word. She took the package carefully, giving him a small nod before he turned and left, disappearing into the night. Curiosity burned in me, but Edith just placed the package behind the counter and said, "Not tonight." I didn't press her. Over time, I'd learned she had her reasons. The next day, she didn't show up for her shift. This was unusual. Edith was never late. When I called her, there was no answer. I figured maybe she'd had an appointment or something, so I opened the shop myself. But that package, the one from the night before, was still sitting there on the counter. It looked almost out of place, with its faded cloth tied in an odd, almost ritualistic knot. I couldn't help myself. I untied the cloth, slowly revealing a small, ornate box. The wood was dark and smooth, polished to an unnatural shine, with strange carvings along the edges. They weren't like any symbols I'd ever seen, swirling shapes that seemed to change the more I looked at them, almost moving in the dim light. It had a small brass latch, and I could feel a strange warmth radiating from it, like it was alive. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but eventually I couldn't resist. I flipped the latch and opened the box. Inside was a pocket watch. It was the most beautiful and eerie thing I'd ever seen. The case was tarnished silver, and through the glass, I could see the hands ticking forward in perfect rhythm, but backwards. The numbers on the face weren't in the usual order, either. They spiraled inward, becoming smaller and smaller until they vanished into the center. I stared at it, entranced, until a strange chill passed over me, snapping me out of my daze. I quickly closed the box and shoved it back under the counter, feeling like I'd just seen something I wasn't supposed to. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that watch face, the numbers spiraling endlessly, ticking backward. Around 3 a.m., I heard a faint ticking sound coming from the direction of my closet. I sat up, holding my breath, straining to listen. It grew louder, like the ticking was coming closer. I could almost feel it moving through the walls, echoing into the room, a steady, relentless rhythm. I barely slept, and the next morning, I dragged myself back to the shop. Edith still wasn't there, but there was a note waiting for me on the counter, in her delicate, slanted handwriting. "Whatever you do, don't open the watch." My stomach twisted. I knew Edith couldn't have been in the store last night. The doors had been locked, and I'd been the last one out. I picked up the note with shaking hands, and as I did, the faint ticking started again, this time from somewhere beneath the counter. I crouched down, and there was the box, somehow shifted from where I'd left it, the watch inside ticking away. I couldn't just leave it there. With Edith missing, it felt like the watch was some kind of twisted responsibility I'd inherited, so I shoved it into my bag and took it home with me that night. As soon as I stepped inside, though, I regretted it. The atmosphere in my apartment felt off, like the air was thicker, harder to breathe. I could hear the ticking now, clear as day, coming from the bag no matter where I was in the apartment. That night, I barely slept. Every time I'd start to drift off, the ticking would grow louder, echoing in my skull, until I jolted awake, my heart racing. At one point, I swear I heard a voice, a soft whisper, calling my name, saying it like it was testing the sound of it. I lay there, paralyzed, until the first light of dawn crept in through the window, breaking the spell. The next day, I tried to bring the watch back to the shop, but the front door wouldn't open. It was like the lock had rusted shut overnight. No one answered when I knocked, and I didn't have Edith's phone number. When I tried calling the shop phone, it just rang endlessly. That night, the ticking started again, louder than ever. I tried burying the box under pillows, shoving it in a drawer, but no matter where I put it, the sound filled the apartment. At one point, I got desperate and opened it, hoping that maybe winding the watch would make it stop. The second I touched the watch's crown, the ticking stopped. Silence filled the room, thick and unnatural. I let out a sigh of relief. But the relief was short-lived. I felt the air shift like someone was standing behind me. I turned, and there he was, the man from the shop. He was standing just inside my doorway, his shadow stretching across the floor, impossibly long, even though the lights were off. "Time is a funny thing, isn't it?" he said, his voice low, almost amused. "You think you have so much of it, but it has a way of slipping right through your fingers." I tried to speak, but no sound came out. My mouth went dry as I stared at him, and I realized that his outline wasn't quite solid. His edges blurred and shimmered, like he was only half real. He stepped closer, his footsteps soundless, and extended a hand. "It belongs to me," he whispered, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "You opened the watch, and now you're part of it." He held out his hand expectantly, and in a daze, I lifted the watch from the box and placed it in his palm. He wrapped his fingers around it, and in an instant, he vanished, dissolving into shadows. The ticking stopped. The room felt empty, like he'd taken something vital with him. The next morning, I went back to the shop, hoping Edith would finally be there. This time, the door opened easily, and when I stepped inside, there she was, sitting behind the counter as if nothing had happened. "Edith," I said, breathless. Where were you?" She just smiled that small, cryptic smile and said, "I had a feeling you'd take care of things." I tried to explain about the man, about the watch, but she just held up a hand to stop me. "Some things, Mr. Cross, are better left in the dark." I left the shop that day and never went back. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I still hear it, the faint ticking sound like the watch is still keeping track of my moments, counting down, waiting for me to run out of time. 3 years ago, I took on an overnight job as a security guard at a sprawling, run-down retirement community on the edge of town. It wasn't like a nice, quiet assisted living facility. It was a worn-out building that had seen better days, housing mostly elderly people who either had no family to care for them or were living out their final years in relative solitude. The place had a strange air about it. Dim lights, creaky hallways, and an atmosphere that felt like it had absorbed years of sadness, loneliness, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I worked the midnight to 8 a.m. shift, which meant I was alone, patrolling the grounds and responding to whatever calls the residents' emergency buttons might trigger. Most nights were quiet, with the occasional incident, a lost resident, a minor fall, or a beeping alarm. It was a straightforward, if eerie, job, but I was getting used to it. The building itself was older than any of the residents, full of little quirks, strange drafts, lights that flickered even though I'd replaced the bulbs, and the constant sound of pipes groaning, as if the building were alive and breathing. One night, close to 3 a.m., I was sitting in the security office reviewing logs when I got a call on the emergency intercom. It was a low, raspy voice, and the connection was crackling, like an old radio. The voice said, "Help, room 409, then trailed off. I quickly pulled up the resident list and saw that room 409 belonged to a man named Mr. Salazar, an elderly gentleman who rarely left his room. I'd only seen him once or twice. Thin, frail, with a distant look in his eyes, like he was staring at something only he could see. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way down the dimly lit hallways, the floorboards creaking with each step. As I walked, I realized something strange. Every other door I passed was closed, but they all seemed to have their lights on inside. It wasn't typical for residents to be up this late, and it added a surreal, unsettling feeling to the whole scene. When I finally reached room 409, I knocked lightly. "Mr. Salazar? It's the night guard. Is everything all right?" No response. I tried again, louder this time, but was met with silence. Growing more concerned, I unlocked the door with my key and pushed it open, shining my flashlight around the room. The bed was neatly made, and everything appeared in order. But Mr. Salazar wasn't there. I called his name again, stepping further into the room. The air inside was stale and slightly cool, with a faint metallic smell like rusted metal. I panned my flashlight across the walls and stopped when I noticed something chilling. There were words scratched into the wall above the bed, faint and jagged. They read, "They're in the walls." My heart pounded as I stepped closer, trying to make sense of it. The scratches looked old, as if they'd been there for years, but the words were unmistakable. "They're in the walls." I tried to convince myself it was just some strange prank, maybe left by a previous resident, but something about it felt raw, desperate. Just as I was about to leave, I heard it. A faint scratching sound like fingernails scraping against wood coming from the wall to my left. I froze, listening, and the sound grew louder, more insistent, like someone trapped behind the plaster, trying to claw their way out. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and that's when I heard something even more chilling. A voice, faint and barely audible, like it was coming from deep within the walls. "Oh, please." The voice was weak, whispering, and it sounded disturbingly like Mr. Salazar. I felt a wave of nausea as I tried to rationalize what I was hearing, but nothing made sense. The voice continued, soft and pleading, then faded into silence. I didn't want to stay in that room any longer. I rushed out, closing the door behind me, and took a few deep breaths, trying to calm down. I told myself it was just my imagination, that maybe the sounds were from the old pipes or something equally explainable. I went back to the office, determined to finish my shift and forget what I'd heard. But just as I sat down, the emergency intercom crackled to life again. "Help! Room 409. It was the same voice, the same plea. My skin crawled, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I knew there was no one in that room. I just checked it myself, but the voice was unmistakable, and the desperation in it was real. Unable to ignore it, I reluctantly made my way back to the 4th floor. The hallway felt darker this time, heavier, and when I reached room 409, I hesitated. I was about to knock when I noticed something strange. The door was slightly open, even though I'd locked it myself. I slowly pushed it open, shining my flashlight around, and froze. There, lying on the bed, was Mr. Salazar. But he looked different. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His mouth was slightly open, and his hands were clenched into tight fists. I took a shaky step closer, calling his name, but he didn't respond. He looked like he hadn't moved in hours. Then, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. His fingernails were caked with a dark, rusty substance, as if he'd been clawing at something. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but then I heard it again, that scratching sound, this time louder, coming from the wall right behind his bed. I staggered back, horrified, as the scratching grew more frantic, more desperate, like something trapped, clawing its way to freedom. I didn't know what to do, but my instincts kicked in, and I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me and sprinting down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. I made it back to the security office, locked the door, and sat there trembling. I tried to call the main office to report what I'd seen, but the phone line was dead. I could only sit there, heart pounding, listening to the silence, afraid to move. When the morning staff arrived, I told them everything, even though I knew how crazy it sounded. They didn't believe me at first, But when they checked room 409, they found Mr. Salazar lying there just as I described. But here's the part that still haunts me. When they called his family to inform them of his passing, they discovered that Mr. Salazar had actually passed away in his sleep the night before around 10 p.m., long before I'd received those calls for help. The official report said he died peacefully, but I knew better. I knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen, and every so often I still have nightmares about that night, about the scratching in the walls, about the voice calling for help. And sometimes, in those dreams, I swear I can hear him whispering, faint but insistent, "They're in the walls, they're in the walls." Tuesday night in October, the kind of night where the air hangs thick with the smell of fallen leaves and the promise of rain. I was walking home from a late shift at the bookstore, my hands stuffed into the pockets of my old coat, my footsteps the only sound echoing through the quiet streets. I liked closing up alone, the creak of the shelves as I turned off the lights, the comforting solitude of locking the door behind me. There was something almost sacred about a bookstore at night. As I turned the corner onto my street, I noticed a glow spilling out from the alley just ahead, bright enough to catch my attention. Normally, I would have kept walking, but something about it tugged at me, like the flicker of light held a secret. I peered around the corner and froze. The alley was lit with dozens of small, glass jars, each one glowing softly from within, casting a warm, almost magical light across the cracked pavement. Someone had arranged them in clusters, like little constellations, and at the far end of the alley, a figure stood, carefully lighting each one with a long match. He looked up, meeting my gaze. I expected him to be startled, but he only smiled, a slow, easy smile that felt like it had been waiting just for me. "You found it," he said, as if this alley full of glowing jars was something people stumbled upon all the time. I took a hesitant step forward, glancing around at the jars, each one filled with a flickering tea light that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He tilted his head, as though considering the question. "It's a little project of mine. I light them up once in a while. Never know who's going to find it." I let out a soft laugh, the absurdity of the moment catching up with me. "So, you just set up lanterns in an alley for strangers?" He nodded, his smile widening. "Everyone needs a little light sometimes, and some people don't realize it until they're wandering in the dark." I looked at him, really looked at him. He was probably close to my age, mid-20s, with shaggy hair that fell over his eyes and hands that moved with a quiet steadiness, like he'd done this 100 times before. "And you just wait here? To see who shows up?" "Something like that." He shrugged, glancing at the jars with a fondness that made them feel almost like old friends. "It's kind of an experiment. People react differently when they find something unexpected. Some people just walk by. Some stop and take a jar with them. I always wonder where they take the light." I didn't know what to say. I'd never met anyone who'd set up a secret lantern display in an alley, much less with the intention of giving them away. I walked over to the nearest jar, crouching down to study it more closely. The candle inside was nearly spent, its flame wavering slightly, and I felt an inexplicable pang of protectiveness over it. "What's your name?" I asked, looking back up at him. "Sam," he said, his voice quiet. "And you?" "Piper." "Piper." He nodded, as if the name fit right into the rhythm of the night. We fell into a comfortable silence, both of us watching the jars flicker in the cool breeze. There was a strange beauty in it, something soft and unassuming, like the jars were meant to be found by accident, little beacons of warmth in a city that often felt too big and too cold. "Why lanterns?" I asked after a while. He shrugged, sliding his hands into his pockets. "Light is simple. It's there or it isn't, but it changes things. It fills empty spaces, makes things feel less lonely. I don't know, maybe it's a silly idea, but I like the thought of strangers carrying around pieces of it." I nodded, thinking of all the people who might have walked through this alley, maybe late at night, or on their way home from somewhere else. People who would never think to look around the corner, but might be drawn in by a small, unexpected glow. And for a second, I could see it. The jars lighting up dark rooms, little pieces of Sam's quiet magic scattered across the city. "I think it's kind of beautiful," I said honestly. "Not many people would do something like this." He smiled a soft, grateful smile and reached for one of the jars, carefully lifting it by the glass neck. "Here," he said, holding it out to me. "Take it." I blinked, taken aback. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "That's the whole point. Besides, I can always make more." I took the jar from him, the warmth of it seeping into my hands. It was small and delicate, and for some reason, holding it made me feel like I'd been given something precious, something to take care of. I looked up, feeling a swell of gratitude that I couldn't quite put into words. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," he replied, his gaze steady. "For stopping, for noticing." I stood there, jar in hand, feeling like I was on the edge of something I couldn't quite name. The city felt different somehow, like the streets held more secrets than I'd ever realized, and I was only just beginning to understand how to see them. Eventually, Sam glanced at the street, as if sensing it was time for the moment to end. "I should get going," he said, his tone casual, but there was a wistfulness in his expression, a quiet kind of farewell. "Will you do this again?" I asked, not wanting to let go of the night just yet. "Maybe," he said with a small grin. "Or maybe I'll try something else. Keep an eye out." And with that, he slipped away, disappearing around the corner like he was part of the shadows. I stood there alone, the jar warm in my hands, watching the last of the candles flicker before finally burning out. When I got home, I placed the jar on my windowsill, the glass still faintly warm to the touch. It sat there for weeks, catching the morning light and casting little rainbows across my apartment. It became a quiet reminder, a tiny piece of a stranger's kindness glowing in my space. A reminder that there were still unexpected wonders hidden in the cracks of the world. In the months that followed, I found myself wandering down unfamiliar streets, peering around corners, hoping to catch another glimpse of something unexpected. I never saw Sam again, but every so often, I'd find a small paper lantern tucked under a bench or a string of lights woven into a tree, and I'd feel his presence, like a quiet invitation to keep looking, to keep believing that maybe, in the strangest places, I'd find light waiting just for me. It all began with a scent. I noticed it one evening as I walked into my apartment. A faint but distinct smell, lingering in the air like smoke or wet earth. It reminded me of a forest floor after a heavy rain, damp and a little metallic. I didn't think much of it at first, chalking it up to some weird draft or maybe a neighbor's cooking mishap. But over the next few days, it grew stronger. It was there every time I walked through the door, greeting me like an unwelcome guest. I tried cleaning, scrubbing every corner, lighting candles, spraying air freshener, but nothing helped. The smell was always there, stronger some days, lighter on others, but never fully gone. It clung to the air, to the walls, even to my clothes. A few days later, I started noticing another strange thing. The smell seemed to move. One evening, it was strongest by the kitchen sink, lingering in a thick cloud near the drain. The next day, it was in the hallway and then by my bed. Each time, it felt like it was creeping closer, inching through the apartment like it was searching for something. Or maybe for someone. That Friday, I was working late, buried in paperwork, when I got a text from my neighbor Sarah. "Hey, just checking in. You okay? Heard some weird noises coming from your place." I frowned. I hadn't been home all day. I texted back, "I'm at work." "What noises?" "Like someone moving furniture around." "And whispering," she replied. I stared at my phone, a chill prickling up my spine. I quickly told her I'd be home soon, grabbed my things, and practically ran to my car. As I drove, the unease settled over me like a heavy fog. Whispering? Moving furniture? I lived alone, and I hadn't left anything on that could have made noise. When I got home, the smell hit me even before I opened the door. It was overpowering now, thick and almost sour, and I felt my stomach twist as I stepped inside. I turned on every light, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the apartment was empty. Still, the smell was stronger than ever, so potent that my eyes watered. I forced myself to walk through every room, every closet, even under the bed, but found nothing out of place. Nothing at all. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear a faint rustling, like something dragging across the floor, or a soft, wet sound, as though something was shifting just beneath the floorboards. Around 3 a.m., I gave up, sitting on my bed with my knees pulled to my chest, waiting for the sun to rise. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I called my landlord, who seemed less than pleased to hear from me. "There's a smell," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's awful, and it's moving around the apartment. And my neighbor heard noises coming from here while I was out." There was a long pause. Then he said, "Well, look, I can have someone come take a look, but maybe you should know that the last tenant, she moved out unexpectedly. Left a lot of things behind. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I can have someone inspect the place, just in case." He wouldn't say anything else, but his tone left me uneasy, as though there was more he wasn't telling me. Still, the promise of someone checking it out was enough to calm me a little. The inspector came by that afternoon, a gruff man with a thick coat and a toolbox. He checked every corner, every wall, muttering to himself as he went. Finally, he walked into my bedroom, stood still for a long moment, then turned to look at me. "Has it moved around?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes," I said, surprised he'd guessed. "How did you know?" He didn't answer, just continued searching. I followed him into the hallway, where he paused, his eyes fixed on the far wall. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "places have pockets, hidden spaces, things we can't always see." "What do you mean?" I asked, my skin prickling. He sighed, shaking his head as though he'd said too much. "Some buildings just settle wrong, develop spaces that weren't there before. But it's nothing to worry about," he added quickly. "If it happens again, just call the landlord. He'll know what to do." I didn't press further, even though his words echoed in my mind long after he left. What kind of space appears out of nowhere? And why hadn't the landlord warned me about the last tenant? That night, I lay in bed, every nerve on edge, listening to the silence around me. But as the hours passed, the quiet gave way to soft noises, a faint dripping like water falling on stone, and that same awful smell, more pungent than ever. I could feel it settling over me, sinking into the room like fog. I sat up, unable to take it any longer, and turned on my lamp. That's when I saw it. On the far wall, directly across from my bed, there was a small, dark patch, like damp spreading out in the shape of a hand. I stared, my heart pounding, as the stain grew larger, stretching upward, its shape twisting and curling. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, like something was pushing through from the other side. I backed away, my mouth dry. As the stain continued to expand, the wall bulging outward, forming a slight indentation, as though something was pressing against it, trying to get through. The stench was overwhelming now, and the sounds were louder, a sick, squelching noise filling the room. And then there was a knock. It was soft, almost polite, coming from the other side of the wall. My body locked in place, every instinct screaming to run, but I couldn't move. The knock came again, a little louder this time, followed by a faint, dragging sound, like something heavy scraping along stone. Slowly, I reached out, a trembling hand, touching the wall. The surface was cold, damp, and it pulsed under my fingers, almost like flesh. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but deep down, I knew that whatever was in that wall was alive, or at least it had been once. And then, a voice, a faint whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Let me out!" I stumbled back, clutching my chest, feeling my heart hammering against my ribs. The wall bulged again, and I could see something shifting beneath the surface, a shadow moving just beneath the paint. The voice grew louder, insistent, pleading. "Let me out!" The air felt thick, stifling, and I could barely breathe as I backed toward the door, never taking my eyes off the wall. My hand found the knob, and I turned, throwing the door open and stumbling into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. I stayed with a friend that night, unable to explain what had happened, barely able to process it myself. The next day, I returned to the apartment with the landlord, determined to confront whatever horror lay behind that wall. But when we opened the door, everything was normal. The smell was gone, the room was quiet, and there was no sign of the stain. The landlord looked at me like I was crazy, muttering about overactive imaginations, and left without another word. But I knew what I'd seen. I'd heard it, smelled it, felt it pressing against the wall. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. Months later, I was scrolling online when I saw an article about the building, about a tenant who had gone missing. The police had found strange stains on the walls, handprints that led to nowhere, vanishing into solid plaster. And the last line of the article stayed with me, haunting me long after I'd finished reading. The smell of damp earth and wet stone still lingers in the empty apartment, as though something is waiting for someone to let it out. It all started when I received a package I hadn't ordered. It was a Saturday morning, and I was on my way out to grab coffee when I nearly tripped over the box, lying right outside my door. No label, no return address, just a plain, brown cardboard box with my name scrawled on top in black marker. The handwriting was jagged and unfamiliar. Curious, I carried it inside, setting it down on my kitchen table. I sat down, staring at it for a moment, trying to figure out who could have sent it. I didn't have a birthday coming up, and it wasn't close to the holidays. I ran through my small list of friends, but none of them would have done something like this. They'd have sent me a text at the very least, giving me a heads up. I checked my phone, but there were no messages, no missed calls. After a moment's hesitation, I decided to open it. I grabbed a knife, carefully slicing the tape, and slowly peeled back the flaps. Inside was an old-fashioned VHS tape. Just that, and nothing else. The sight of it threw me. I hadn't seen a VHS in years, and I certainly didn't own a player. But this one was strange, no label, no branding. It was just a plain, black cassette heavy in my hand. As I turned it over, I felt a strange pull, a curiosity that was quickly edged out by unease. Who would send me something like this? For a second, I considered tossing it out, but something made me stop. Maybe it was the mystery of it, the strangeness of receiving something so out of place. I took it with me to the thrift store down the street, figuring they might have an old VHS player that actually worked. To my surprise, they did. I picked it up along with a bundle of random tapes to test it out, to make sure it wasn't just the usual thrift store junk. The cashier looked at the blank VHS in my hand as I checked out, giving me a strange look, but I just shrugged it off, feeling a little self-conscious. When I got home, I set up the VHS player, fumbling a bit as I connected it to my TV. It hummed to life, surprisingly functional. I hesitated before putting the tape in, feeling that creeping sense of unease again, but I couldn't help myself. The screen crackled to life with static, hissing and popping until the image cleared. At first, it was hard to make out anything at all. The picture was grainy, and the colors were faded, like it had been left out in the sun for years. Then the image settled, and I saw my living room. I leaned forward, confused. The angle was slightly skewed, like the camera had been hidden somewhere, maybe up near the ceiling, but it was unmistakable. I could see my own couch, my bookshelves, the picture frames I had arranged just so. My stomach twisted as I watched the screen, feeling a sick, sinking dread. The footage was silent, but I could see movement in the room. Someone was there, a shadowy figure, just out of frame, moving slowly, as if they were trying not to disturb anything. My eyes darted back and forth between the screen and my own living room, half expecting to see someone standing there. But my room was empty, just as I'd left it. On the screen, the figure reached out, their hand trailing along the edge of my bookshelf, fingers brushing against my things. I felt a chill creep up my spine, imagining the cold weight of a stranger's hand touching my belongings. They moved slowly, their body only half visible in the dim light, like they were more shadow than substance. Then they stopped right in front of the camera. I couldn't see their face, but they turned slightly, their head tilting toward the lens as if they knew I'd be watching. And then they waved, just a slow, deliberate wave, the fingers bending in a way that felt mocking, taunting. The screen went black. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing, trying to process what I'd just seen. Who had filmed that? How had they gotten into my apartment? I felt a rising panic, a desperate urge to check every corner of my place, to make sure I was alone. But just as I reached for the remote to turn it off, the screen crackled to life again. This time, the footage was clearer. The angle had changed closer, pointed directly at my couch. I swallowed hard, watching as the camera zoomed in, focusing on the spot where I was sitting right now. And then, As if on cue, I saw something move at the edge of the frame. Another shadow sliding into view, creeping toward the couch, toward where I was sitting. My breath caught, and I glanced around the room, feeling like something was lurking just behind me. But there was no one there. On the screen, the figure came closer, close enough that I could almost make out the outline of a face, hollow eyes staring right into the camera. And then the screen filled with static once again. Before I could react, a new image flickered onto the screen. It was a close-up of a hand, pale, with long, thin fingers, holding a piece of paper up to the camera. The handwriting was jagged and hurried, as if it had been scrawled in a panic. I squinted, reading the words, "Look outside your door." My heart thundered, and I felt rooted to the spot, caught between wanting to look and wanting to run. Slowly, I stood, every nerve on edge, and crept toward my front door. I put my hand on the knob, took a deep breath, and swung it open. The hallway outside was empty. I let out a shaky sigh, feeling a mix of relief and lingering dread. But as I turned to close the door, I noticed something on the floor, a piece of paper, folded neatly, lying right outside my doorframe. I picked it up with trembling hands, unfolding it slowly, knowing I wouldn't like what I found. The note was written in the same jagged handwriting as on the tape. It read, "You shouldn't have watched." I dropped the note, my skin crawling, and ran back inside, slamming the door behind me. I unplugged the VHS player, shoving it and the tape back into the box, as if that could somehow erase what I'd seen. But as I stood there, breathing hard, I realized something else. There was a sound coming from the box, faint and scratchy, like the muffled rustling of fabric. I hesitated, then slowly leaned in, listening. The sound grew louder, sharper, until I could make out words. A voice, whispering from inside the tape. "I'm still here." That was when the lights went out. The entire apartment plunged into darkness, leaving me alone in the silence, with only the memory of that shadowed figure and the chilling, lingering feeling that I was not alone. And then I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock on my front door, echoing through the empty apartment. 3 slow knocks, patient waiting. I didn't answer. I stood there, frozen, as the knocking continued, steady, relentless, filling the room until I thought I might scream. Finally, it stopped, leaving only silence. But now, every night since, I hear it. Always 3 knocks, coming from the hallway. And I know, somehow, that if I ever open that door, I won't be the one closing it. When I was 17, my parents moved us to a tiny, nearly empty town in the Midwest. They'd always wanted to get out of the city, and my mom had a knack for finding good deals. She'd stumbled upon this property online, a big, 3-story Victorian house at the edge of town, going for almost nothing. The story went that it had been empty for decades, and when no one showed interest, the price just kept dropping. My parents couldn't resist, even though the place was old, falling apart, and honestly pretty creepy. I'd always been skeptical about the whole haunted house thing, so I tried not to let the vibe bother me. But from the minute we stepped inside, the house felt strange. It wasn't the usual kind of old house weirdness, like creaky floors or dusty smells. It was the layout. The house didn't make sense. The rooms weren't quite right. Some of the doorways were too narrow, some of the ceilings too low. One of the bedrooms had a closet that slanted upward at an angle, like it was squeezing into a gap it wasn't supposed to fit into. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been rearranged in some weird, almost impossible way. My parents laughed it off, saying it was just quirky. I let it go, but I could never shake the feeling that something about the place was wrong. One of the strangest things was the staircase to the attic. It was narrow and crooked, hidden behind a small door in the hallway. The stairs went up steeply, like they were leading to some secret space that was never meant to be reached. My parents said the attic was empty and that we wouldn't need to go up there until we decided to renovate. They even put a padlock on the door just to be safe. For a few weeks, things were quiet. The house was cold and drafty, but I got used to it. I spent my time exploring, trying to find something cool in this creaky old place. But every now and then, I'd hear something odd, like faint shuffling sounds coming from above. Sometimes it was so soft, I'd convince myself it was my imagination. Other times, it was louder, almost like something scratching or scraping against wood. One night, the sounds were so loud that they woke me up. It was a faint thumping, like someone was moving something heavy across the attic floor. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, and just lay there listening. The noise would start, then stop, then start again, like something was dragging itself slowly from one side of the attic to the other. I told my parents the next day, and they dismissed it as settling noises. I almost believed them, until I overheard my mom whispering to my dad that she'd heard the same thing in the middle of the night. They didn't talk about it after that, and we tried to get on with our lives. One evening, I came home late from school, and the house was completely dark. My parents had gone into town, so I let myself in, flipped on the lights, and made my way to the kitchen. I was heating up some leftovers when I heard something faint, almost like a hum. At first, I thought it was the fridge or some old pipe groaning. But then it changed, turning into a low, rhythmic noise, like a chant or a murmur. I froze, listening, and slowly I realized it was coming from the attic. The humming grew louder, filling the house, a pulsing sound that seemed to move through the walls. It wasn't music, but something older, stranger, a droning, hypnotic sound that felt ancient, like something from a dream. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The house was silent, the only sound my own breath. I told myself I was just tired, hearing things, but something in me knew that it had been real. There was something up there, something waiting. I tried to shake it off, finished my food, and went to bed. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made my skin crawl. Around midnight, just as I was finally drifting off, I heard the faint scratching again, coming from above. This time, though, it didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, as if something were making its way down the stairs. I held my breath, staring at my bedroom door, half expecting it to swing open. The sound moved down the hall, and then silence. I lay there, waiting, every muscle tense, until finally I drifted off. In the morning, I found something strange in the hallway. There were small, dark marks on the floor like footprints. They led from the attic door down the hall, stopping just outside my room. They were faint, almost as if someone had walked through a thin layer of soot, leaving behind barely their impressions. My parents tried to brush it off, saying it was probably dirt from one of our shoes. But we both knew no one had been up to the attic. A week later, my parents went into town for the day, and I found myself alone again. The house was quiet, and I thought maybe whatever had been happening was over. But as the sun started to set, that feeling crept back, that sense of being watched, as if something were waiting for night to fall. I decided I'd had enough. I was going to find out what was up there once and for all. I grabbed the key to the attic padlock from my parents' room, telling myself it was just a creepy old attic and that there was nothing to be afraid of. I unlocked the door, took a deep breath, and began to climb the stairs. The air grew colder the higher I went, and the strange, heavy silence of the house seemed to press down on me. When I reached the top, I found myself in a small, cramped attic space. Dust filled the air, and the only light came from a single, small window, casting long shadows across the room. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Old boxes, a few broken pieces of furniture, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. But then I noticed something strange in the far corner. A large, old mirror leaning against the wall, covered in a thick sheet. It didn't belong. Everything else looked like it had been there for decades, but the mirror, it looked almost new, completely out of place. I walked over to it, heart pounding, and reached out to lift the sheet. The moment I touched it, I felt a sudden chill, like icy fingers crawling up my spine. I pulled the sheet away, and there, staring back at me, was my own reflection, but not quite. The reflection looked like me, but it was wrong. The face staring back at me had hollow eyes, empty and dark, as if they were endless wells. And the mouth was twisted into a strange, unnatural smile, like it was forced straining. My own mouth was frozen, but the reflection was smiling. I tried to turn away, but I couldn't move. My reflection started to raise a hand, and my body went rigid, like I was paralyzed. It lifted its hand, finger pointed at me, and then it started to move forward, pressing against the glass, as if trying to break through. I felt the air grow colder, the shadows deepening, and that low, humming chant started again, coming from somewhere deep in the mirror, filling my head, vibrating in my bones. Just as it felt like I was going to lose myself, to be pulled into the mirror, I heard a loud crash. The spell broke, and I stumbled back, falling to the floor. My parents were home, calling my name from downstairs. I scrambled to my feet, threw the sheet over the mirror, and ran down the stairs, locking the attic door behind me. I never told them what I saw, but after that day, the house felt different, quieter, like something was waiting, biding its time. A month later, I convinced my parents to sell the place, and I never looked back. But sometimes in my dreams, I still see that mirror. I see my reflection, smiling back at me, hollow-eyed, waiting. And in those dreams, I know that one day, when I look into a mirror, it'll be there, reaching out, waiting to take my place. It started when I found a voicemail from myself. It was a Monday morning, the usual hectic rush to get ready for work. I had barely enough time to grab a coffee, and as I was heading out the door, my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. Strange. I hadn't seen any missed calls, and stranger still, the caller ID was my own number. Curious, I listened to it. The audio was staticky, barely audible, with a faint, rhythmic hum in the background. And then, through the static, I heard my own voice, faint and shaky. Don't go home. The voicemail ended abruptly. I stood there in the doorway, trying to process what I'd just heard. It was undeniably my voice, down to the slight rasp I had when I was stressed or tired. But I had no memory of leaving myself a message, no memory of any reason I would tell myself not to come home. I shook it off, figuring it was some kind of weird tech glitch or prank, and went on with my day. Work was uneventful, though that voicemail lingered in the back of my mind, nagging at me. By the time I got home, I'd all but forgotten about it. But that night, as I was brushing my teeth, my phone buzzed again. Another voicemail, again from my own number. I listened, my hand shaking slightly as I held the phone up to my ear. Don't let them in. My voice sounded strained, almost frantic. There was a desperation in it, a raw edge that sent chills down my spine. And just before the message ended, I heard something in the background, a soft, eerie tapping sound like fingernails tapping on glass. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about the voicemail, about what I might have meant by them. I double-checked my locks, closed every window, drew the curtains. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was out there, watching. The next day, everything was normal. No strange messages, no odd sounds. By evening, I had convinced myself it was all just some elaborate prank, or maybe I was just working too much, letting the stress get to me. But the third voicemail shattered any comfort I had left. It came in at exactly 11:11 p.m. I was lying in bed, almost asleep, when the phone buzzed, jolting me awake. The message started with dead air, static stretching out, crackling like an old radio, until my own voice came through, hoarse and urgent. Get out now. Then silence. I lay there in bed, frozen, the words echoing in my head. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I'd somehow recorded these messages without remembering. But deep down, I knew that was impossible. I didn't have an explanation for the messages, didn't have any reason for that rising dread I felt every time I heard them. I got up, went to the kitchen for a glass of water, trying to calm myself down. I was just stressed, tired. Maybe if I went to bed, I'd wake up feeling better, like all of this had just been a bad dream. Then, just as I was about to head back to bed, my phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. With a shaky hand, I hit play. This time, the message was longer. There was heavy breathing on the other end, erratic and shallow, followed by a faint whisper of my own voice, barely audible over the crackling static. They're here, it said, my voice trembling. They're inside the house. I felt my stomach drop, my hands starting to shake as I glanced around. Every shadow suddenly more sinister, more alive. And then, right at the end of the message, I heard something else, a whisper, a voice that wasn't mine, low and raspy, hissing a single word that sent ice through my veins. Hello? I dropped the phone, backing up, nearly tripping over my own feet as I stared at the device, half expecting it to buzz again. But the apartment was silent. Empty. I glanced around, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to move, to open the door and step outside. And then, as if in answer to my hesitation, my phone buzzed again. Another voicemail from myself. My hands trembled as I pressed play. "It's too late," my voice said, low and final. "They're already inside." The air around me felt thick, stifling. I could feel a presence, something heavy, unseen, lingering just behind me. I was too afraid to turn, too afraid to move. I stood there, frozen, as a chill crawled up my spine, and then I felt it, a cold, light touch on my shoulder. A hand, faint and ethereal, brushing my skin. I bolted, sprinting out of the apartment without a second thought. I drove across town to a friend's place, barely able to keep my hands steady on the wheel. My friend, half asleep and more than a little confused, let me in, listened to my jumbled explanation, and eventually told me I could crash on her couch. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting another voicemail, another message from myself warning me to leave. But the phone was silent. The next morning, I worked up the nerve to go back to my apartment. My friend offered to come with me, but I shook my head, feeling ridiculous, even embarrassed. It was my home, after all. I couldn't let some creepy prank or some weird delusion drive me out of it. When I got back, everything was just as I'd left it. My bag was on the floor by the couch, my jacket draped over the armchair. But there was something different, something subtle that made my skin prickle. On the kitchen counter, next to my keys, was my phone, even though I was sure I'd taken it with me when I left. I picked it up, my heart pounding, and checked for any new messages. Nothing. The voicemails from the night before were gone. But then, just as I was about to set it down, my phone buzzed and a new notification popped up. It was a voicemail. No caller ID this time, just a blank number. With a sense of dread, I pressed play. The message was nothing but silence at first, a faint, heavy quiet that stretched on, broken only by soft, shuffling sounds, like someone moving around in the background. And then, at the very end, I heard my own voice again, low and chilling. "Welcome home," it whispered. The line went dead. I haven't gone back since. I crashed at a motel that night and eventually found a new place, somewhere across town, far away from that building. But sometimes, late at night, I get this feeling like I'm not alone, like someone's watching me. And every now and then, just when I'm about to drift off to sleep, my phone will buzz with a notification, a single missed call from an unknown number. I haven't listened to any of the voicemails. Not yet. But one of these days, I'm afraid I'm... Last year, I took a job working as a night janitor in the archives of a history museum. It wasn't the sort of place that got visitors, since it was basically a long, windowless basement filled with endless shelves of dusty boxes. Old letters, photographs, artifacts, stuff they hadn't even cataloged yet. I didn't mind the work. It was quiet, and I didn't have to talk to anyone, which suited me just fine. My shift started at 9 p.m., and most of the work was typical janitor stuff. Mopping, emptying trash, keeping an eye out for leaks. But I started to notice things, little things that didn't add up. Boxes left open, papers scattered that I knew I hadn't touched. At first, I assumed it was my coworker, Jackson, a guy who worked the early shift. But when I asked him, he seemed just as confused as I was. "Sometimes I feel like I'm cleaning up after a ghost," he joked, though he looked uneasy. I shrugged it off. The place was old, and the archives were packed with weird artifacts, things that gave the whole basement a strange energy. Every so often, I'd feel a draft or catch a whiff of something odd like damp earth, even though there was no window, no way for air to come in. The fluorescent lights would flicker sometimes, but that was normal, I thought. Old wiring. Then about a month in, I found something that stopped me cold. I was cleaning in the back section, where they stored the really old stuff, when I spotted a box that was different from the others. It was larger, made of dark wood, and covered in faded carvings that looked like symbols. The lock was rusty and broken, but the box looked out of place, almost like it didn't belong in a museum at all. I opened it, curiosity getting the better of me. Inside was a stack of old, yellowed papers, handwritten and faded, with edges that had crumbled into dust. On top of the papers, though, was a photograph. It was black and white, and it showed a group of people standing in front of a house. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, waistcoats, long skirts, lace gloves. It was the kind of photo where everyone looked serious, like smiling hadn't been invented yet. But there was one face that didn't fit. In the back row, half hidden behind the others, was a figure in dark clothing, wearing what looked like a hooded cloak. I could barely make out the face, but something about it was wrong. The skin looked stretched pale, almost waxy, and the eyes were wide, staring straight at the camera with an intensity that felt unsettling. No one else was looking at the camera, just that figure in the back, like it knew I'd be looking at it someday. The longer I stared, the more I felt an odd sensation, like the person in the photograph was looking back at me. I shoved the photo back in the box, closed the lid, and pushed it back onto the shelf, telling myself it was just an old picture, just some weird historical relic. But that night, as I walked to the front of the archives, I felt it. A cold, creeping sensation, like someone was watching me from the shadows. Every step I took, the feeling grew stronger, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there. But I was alone. I tried to shake it off, finish my shift, and forget about the photograph. The next night, though, things got worse. I was mopping the floors, just going through the motions, when I heard a faint sound from the back section, a soft, shuffling noise, like footsteps. I froze, listening, but the sound stopped as soon as I moved toward it. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the air conditioning, but there was no air conditioning in the archives. The silence felt heavy, pressing in around me, and I could almost feel that same watchful presence from the night before. I hurried through the rest of my tasks, eager to leave, but as I passed the shelf where I'd found the box, I felt an overwhelming urge to look inside again. I didn't want to. Every instinct told me to just keep walking, to forget I'd ever seen it. But something compelled me, a strange, magnetic pull that I couldn't resist. I opened the box, my hands shaking, and there it was, the photograph, resting on top of the papers, exactly where I'd left it. Only this time, something was different. The hooded figure wasn't in the back row anymore. It had moved, standing in the center of the group, staring directly at the camera with that same unblinking gaze. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of it. It wasn't possible. The photograph was over 100 years old. There was no way it could have changed. I slammed the box shut, shoving it back onto the shelf, and practically ran out of the archives, feeling that cold, creeping dread settle over me. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that I'd quit if I had to. But the next night, my curiosity got the better of me. I showed up for my shift, and right away I noticed something strange. The lights were already on, and I could hear voices coming from the back section. Low, murmuring voices, like a crowd whispering just out of earshot. My stomach twisted as I realized no one else was supposed to be there. "Jackson?" I called, hoping it was him, maybe coming back for something he'd forgotten. But the voices stopped, and the silence that followed was thick, pressing in around me. I stepped into the back section, and there, in the middle of the room, was the wooden box. I hadn't put it there, hadn't touched it since the night before. But it was sitting in plain sight, the lid slightly open, as if inviting me to look inside. I could feel the pull again, stronger this time, impossible to ignore. I reached out, lifting the lid, and found the photograph waiting for me. The people in the photo looked different this time. They weren't standing in front of the house anymore. They were standing in what looked like the archives, in the very room where I was standing. My heart pounded as I scanned the faces, recognizing the shelves, the boxes, the dim lighting. And then I saw it. The hooded figure had moved again. It was standing alone in the foreground, closer to the camera, closer to me, its face twisted into an expression I couldn't read, something between anger and hunger. I could almost see the glint of its eyes through the shadows of the hood, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I dropped the photo, slamming the lid shut, and stumbled back, knocking over a stack of boxes. The lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and shift, like they were reaching toward me. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty aisles, feeling that icy presence following me every step of the way. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath, the cold night air biting into my skin. I called my supervisor, told him I was done, that I couldn't work there anymore. I didn't explain, didn't tell him about the photograph or the figure in the hood. I just quit, walked away, and never looked back. But every so often, I feel it. The same cold, creeping sensation like someone's watching me from the shadows. Sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of a dark figure out of the corner of my eye, standing just beyond the reach of the light. And every night, I dream of that photograph, of the hooded figure moving closer, reaching out, its eyes locked onto mine. I don't know what it wants, but I have a feeling it's not finished with me. It started with the pothose plan. My sister and I used to share an apartment, but she moved out last year, leaving behind a few of her things. I didn't mind. The place was already full of her little touches, vintage knickknacks, half-melted candles, and that thriving pothose that sat on the kitchen counter. I like having it around. It was a hardy little plant that seemed to survive even my neglect. Sometimes I talked to it as I made coffee like it was some kind of leftover roommate. One night, after a late shift at work, I came home, tossed my keys on the counter, and did my usual check-in with the plant. "Still kicking, huh?" I murmured, barely looking at it as I went to pour myself some water. But when I glanced back, I froze. The plant was different. It looked fuller somehow, with more vines than I remembered. And the leaves, they were pointed in a way that almost looked intentional, all stretching in the same direction, like they were reaching out towards a sink. I shrugged it off, figuring I hadn't been paying much attention to it lately. Plants grow, maybe I just hadn't noticed. The next morning, I came into the kitchen and found a single leaf lying in the middle of the floor, far from the counter. It was perfectly green, unblemished, like it had been gently plucked and placed there. I examined the plant, but it looked fine, not a single leaf missing. It was strange, but I didn't think much of it until it kept happening. Every morning, I'd find a fresh leaf somewhere in the apartment, always perfectly green, never wilted or damaged. It was like the plant was shedding these leaves on purpose, leaving them for me. One morning, I found a cluster of them on my pillow. I stared at the pile, feeling a prickle of unease. I went back to the kitchen and examined the plant more closely. The vines had grown longer, trailing down the counter, some of them even curling around the base of the cabinets. It was starting to look overgrown, like it had been thriving too well for the past few days. I hadn't watered it in weeks, but its leaves were a vibrant, unnatural green, almost as if it were glowing. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just a plant after all, but something about it made me feel uneasy, like it was watching me, waiting. A few days later, I came home from work and found the plant's vines stretched out across the counter, one of them draped over my coffee mug. It was strange the way the vines were positioned, almost like fingers stretching towards something. I nudged them aside, feeling a strange urge to apologize as I put the mug back in the cabinet. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard a faint rustling sound, like leaves brushing against each other. I told myself it was just my imagination, probably a breeze from the drafty windows, but sleep didn't come easily. In the morning, I found another cluster of leaves by my bed, arranged in a strange pattern, almost like an arrow pointing toward the door. My stomach twisted as I stared at them, feeling a growing sense of dread. I decided enough was enough. I grabbed the pot hose, wincing as some of the vines wrapped around my wrist like they didn't want to let go, and took it outside. I felt a strange pang of guilt, like I was abandoning an old friend, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was wrong, somehow like it was more than just a plant. I left it by the dumpster, hoping someone else would take it, and tried to forget about it. But that night, I heard it again, the faint rustling, only louder this time, like something was moving just outside my window. I pulled the curtains back, my heart pounding, but the alley was empty. The next morning, I found a single green leaf on my kitchen counter. I was sure I'd thrown the plant away, sure I'd left it far behind, but the leaf was unmistakably from the pot hose, with the same rich green color, the same smooth edges. I threw it in the trash, telling myself it was just some strange coincidence, a prank maybe, but every day, more leaves appeared. They showed up in my shoes, on my toothbrush, tucked into my jacket pocket. Sometimes, I'd find them woven together, like little garlands, left in places I couldn't ignore. I'd wake up to find them under my pillow, perfectly arranged, almost like they'd been placed there with care. Then, one night, I heard something in the hallway, a soft shuffling sound like someone dragging something heavy. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against it, listening. The noise grew louder, closer, until it was right outside my door. I held my breath, heart pounding, as a slow, deliberate knock echoed through the apartment. I didn't answer. I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, as the knocking stopped and the shuffling retreated down the hall. The next morning, I found the plant back on my kitchen counter, its vines stretched out as if nothing had happened. But it was different now. Thicker, fuller, its leaves darker, almost black, with veins of red running through them. The vines were wrapped tightly around the base of the counter, twisting up the cabinets like they were trying to take root. I tried to get rid of it again. I took it to a field miles away, dumping it in the tall grass, and drove home with the windows open, hoping to air out the strange, earthy smell that had filled my car. I felt relieved, almost lighter, as if I'd finally rid myself of whatever strange hold the plant had over me. But that night, the knocking returned, louder and more insistent, echoing through the apartment with a strange, rhythmic quality. I lay in bed, heart racing, listening as the knocks grew faster, more frantic, until it sounded like someone was pounding on the door. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, the plant was back. Its vines had stretched across the counter, winding around my coffee mug, my keys, even my phone, like it was claiming everything I owned. The leaves were almost black now, shimmering with an oily sheen, and the red veins pulsed faintly, like they were alive. I tried to ignore it, to go about my day, but it was everywhere. The vines spread across the floor, curling around the table legs, creeping toward my bed. I could feel it watching me, waiting like it was growing stronger with every passing hour. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt something brush against my arm. I turned on the light, heart pounding, and saw a single vine stretched across the bed, its leaves curling around my wrist. I tried to pull away, but the vine tightened, its grip cold and unyielding. More vines crept up from the floor, wrapping around my legs, my arms, holding me in place. I struggled, feeling the rough edges of the leaves against my skin, but it was no use. The plant held me fast, its tendrils digging into my skin, pulsing with a strange, sickly warmth. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper, like a voice carried on the wind, soft and distant, yet unmistakable. "Don't leave me." The words echoed through my mind, filling me with a sense of dread, of something ancient and unyielding. The plant's grip tightened, its vines spreading across my body, wrapping around my chest, my neck, until I could barely breathe. I closed my eyes, feeling the darkness close in. The last thing I saw, the dark, pulsing leaves and the faint glimmer of red, like a heartbeat, fading into blackness. When my sister called a few days later to check in, no one answered. She came by, worried, and found the apartment empty, everything in place except for the pothose, which had grown lush and sprawling, its vines stretched across the room, its leaves a deep, unnatural green. And at the center of it all, nestled among the leaves, was a single photograph, a picture of me, standing by the plant, smiling. But my eyes, they were empty, as if something else was looking through them, something that had been waiting patiently for a very long time. The first time I noticed something was off with Clara, it was a Tuesday. She'd come home late, which wasn't unusual given her long hours at the design firm. But that night, she slipped in quietly, her usual bright greeting missing. She seemed lost in thought, barely glancing at me before retreating to the bedroom with a mumbled, "Hey, sorry, tired." Normally, she'd flop down beside me on the couch, and we'd exchange stories about our day, each interruption filled with inside jokes and smiles. But that night, she didn't even look up. The next morning, I found her phone on the kitchen counter, still plugged into the charger. She'd already left for work, so I picked it up to bring it to her, until I noticed a notification lighting up the screen. It was from a guy named Matt. The message preview showed, Last night was followed by an ellipsis. That single message felt like a crack, a hairline fracture in something I'd thought was rock solid. I brushed it off, convincing myself that Matt was a coworker. Maybe they'd stayed late working on a project and then grabbed dinner. I wanted to believe that, needed to believe it, so I ignored the sharp edge of doubt. But once I started noticing, the signs were everywhere. She'd started dressing up more, experimenting with a new style, spending more time on her makeup, which was strange because she'd never been one for elaborate routines. When I asked her if she was doing something different, she just shrugged, saying just wanted to change. And that would have been fine, normal, even if she hadn't also started hiding her phone, slipping out of the room to take calls, and cutting our conversation short when I asked about her day. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe she was under pressure at work or just needed her space. But those tiny, nagging doubts kept growing. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground under my feet slowly crumbling. One Friday night, when she said she was going out with some work friends, I asked if I could tag along. She paused, her face tightening ever so slightly, before she said, "I think it's just going to be us, actually. Kind of a work thing, you know?" The moment she left, I sat there, staring at the door, that same nagging suspicion now pounding in my chest. I grabbed my jacket, trying not to think, just moving on impulse. I had no plan, no idea what I'd do or say, but I couldn't just sit there in the dark, letting my mind spiral. I followed her, staying a safe distance, feeling a mix of guilt and panic. She met him at a little wine bar across town, a place I'd never been. I stood outside, watching them through the large glass windows, my breath fogging up the cold night air. There she was, leaning in close to him, laughing in that uninhibited way that I used to think was reserved just for us. Her hand was on his arm, and they looked comfortable, familiar. They looked like more than friends. I don't know how long I stood there. I wanted to burst in, confront them, demand an explanation, but I couldn't move. Eventually, I turned and left, walking aimlessly down the street, feeling like a shadow in my own life. I'd been living with this person for years, sharing everything, and here she was living an entirely separate life right in front of me. I spent that night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, wondering what I'd say to her. When she came home, she tried to sneak past me, heading straight for the bedroom. But I called her name, my voice barely above a whisper, and she froze. She turned slowly, looking at me with wide eyes. I asked her straight out, "Who's Matt?" Her face paled, and she hesitated just a moment too long. That hesitation was enough. She tried to brush it off, saying he was just a friend from work, that I was overthinking things. But I could see the truth in her eyes, in the way she wouldn't look directly at me. I told her I'd seen them, that I'd been there, that I knew. She finally sat down, deflating like a balloon, and started talking. She said it had started as just friendship, that she'd never meant for it to go further, but somewhere along the way, lines had blurred. She said she'd felt trapped in the life we'd built, like she was losing herself, but hadn't known how to tell me. Her words came out haltingly, carefully chosen, like she was picking through broken glass. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just listened, feeling numb, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. When she finished, I told her to leave. She tried to apologize, to explain herself, but I couldn't hear it. I'd seen the look in her eyes when she was with him. That ease, that comfort that used to be ours. Over the next few days, the apartment felt emptier than I'd ever known it could. Her things were gone, but her presence lingered in the strangest ways. In the half-empty jar of almond butter she kept in the fridge, the way the pillows on the couch still held the shape of where she used to sit. Everything was a reminder, a painful echo of a life that no longer existed. I didn't know how to move forward. I drifted from day to day, going through the motions, trying to rebuild some kind of normalcy. Friends reached out, inviting me out, telling me to move on. But moving on felt impossible, like trying to erase years of memories, like trying to unlive a life. Then one evening, months later, I was walking home from work and I passed a wine bar. I stopped, staring at it for a long time, remembering the way I'd watched them from the sidewalk, the way it had felt like the ground was falling out from under me. But this time, the feeling was different, softer, less jagged. I could see it as a part of my past, a moment that had happened but didn't define me. In the weeks that followed, I started to reclaim my life, piece by piece. I rearranged the apartment, got rid of things that reminded me of her, filled the space with new memories, ones that belonged to me alone. I took up running, started cooking meals I'd never tried before, made plans with friends, slowly filling the empty spaces with things that felt like mine. One afternoon, I ran into her at a park. She was with a friend, laughing, looking like she hadn't a care in the world. She saw me, gave a small, awkward wave, and for a moment, I felt a pang of something. Nostalgia, maybe a regret. But it faded quickly, replaced by a quiet acceptance. I nodded back and walked away, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. In the end, Clara was a chapter in my life, a part of a story that had changed me but didn't define me. I'd learned that love doesn't always mean forever, that sometimes people drift apart, and that letting go can be an act of love in itself. And as I walked away, I felt free to write my own story, one that was just beginning. About a year ago, I took a job managing a remote, high-end vacation property up in the mountains. It was the off-season, so the place was completely empty, giving me time to learn the ropes before guests started arriving for ski season. The property was beautiful. 3 sprawling cabins tucked away in the woods, each equipped with huge windows, stone fireplaces, and all the luxuries. My duties were simple: maintain the property, check the cabins regularly, and make sure everything was in working order. The cabins were scattered far enough apart that you couldn't see one from the other, each positioned to feel as if it were the only building in the world. It was peaceful at first. I'd wake up to deer grazing in the early morning mist, hear the trees creak with the wind, and at night, there was absolute silence. It felt like the start of a long vacation. One of my tasks was to check the security cameras every morning. Each cabin had a set of cameras covering the entrances and surrounding areas. There was a small security room in the main lodge where I could view all the footage. Most mornings, there was nothing to see, just snow falling, branches swaying. It felt like an easy, almost cushy job, but one morning about 2 weeks in, I noticed something strange. The camera feed for cabin 3 had a few seconds of static at 2:17 a.m. It wasn't that unusual. Weather or technical glitches could cause interference. But then I saw the same static again at 2:17 a.m. the next night, and the next. Every single night, the feed went fuzzy at the exact same time, lasting for exactly 12 seconds before snapping back to normal. The first few nights, I brushed it off, thinking it was a glitch. But by the 4th night, I was too curious to ignore it. So, around 2 a.m., I bundled up, grabbed a flashlight, and decided to walk over to cabin 3 to check things out. The night was bitterly cold, the air thick with the smell of pine, and the snow crunched loudly under my boots. As I approached the cabin, I felt an odd sense of unease settle over me. But the cabin was empty and quiet, just like the rest. Nothing seemed out of place. The next night, I watched the feed closely from the security room, a cup of coffee in hand, determined to catch whatever was causing the static. Right at 2:17, the screen flickered to static again. But this time, in the midst of the white noise, I thought I could make out a faint image like someone was standing right in front of the camera. It was hard to tell, but there was definitely a shadow just barely visible through the static. I leaned closer, squinting, but as soon as it had appeared, the image was gone. After that, things started to get weirder. I began hearing strange sounds outside at night. A faint tapping on the windows, the crunch of footsteps in the snow when I knew no one else was around. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving between the cabins in the dead of night. Each morning, I'd find small disturbances around cabin 3. Footprints in the snow, branches broken near the windows, a couple of scratches on the cabin's exterior walls. It was subtle, but each morning there was something new. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to keep watch from inside cabin 3 itself. I figured if there was something or someone messing with the place, I'd catch them in the act. I made myself comfortable by the fireplace and waited, flashlight at my side, keeping one eye on my watch. The minutes dragged by, and everything was silent except for the occasional groan of the cabin settling and the wind outside. Then, at exactly 2:17, I heard a light scraping sound like something brushing against the window. I turned, my heart pounding, and saw a shape in the darkness just outside. It was tall, hunched, with limbs that seemed a bit too long, pressing up against the glass. I froze, watching as it moved slowly along the window, a faint outline against the night. The figure paused, as if it sensed me watching, then pressed its face closer to the glass. Even in the dark, I could see its eyes, pale, almost reflective, staring into the cabin with an unsettling intensity. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to turn off the light, hide, but I couldn't move. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity, unmoving, watching me through the glass. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving only footprints trailing away from the cabin, too long and thin to belong to any animal I'd ever seen. The next morning, I reviewed the footage, desperate for some kind of explanation, but the camera had cut to static again, right at 2:17. The only evidence of what I'd seen was the snow outside, with those elongated footprints leading back into the woods. After that night, the noises grew louder, more insistent. Every night, there was something, scraping along the walls, soft knocking at the doors, footsteps pacing around the cabin. I started feeling eyes on me whenever I did my rounds, like someone was watching from the trees, just out of sight. And every morning, the cameras would cut out at the same time, catching only glimpses of that tall, shadowy figure standing somewhere near cabin 3. I tried to report it to my boss, but he just laughed it off, saying the property had its quirks and that guests loved the ghost stories. When I insisted, he told me to get some rest, assured me it was just the isolation getting to my head. I wasn't so sure. Finally, one night, I decided I'd had enough. I was alone miles from town, and whatever was out there clearly knew it. I packed my things, ready to drive back to civilization. But as I made my way through the property, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I hurried to my car, and as I started the engine, I glanced back at cabin 3. Standing in the window, clear as day, was the figure. But now, in the soft glow of my headlights, I could see its face, or the lack of one. It was blank, featureless, its skin pale and smooth like stretched wax. It raised a hand, long fingers pressing against the glass, as if it were beckoning me back inside. I floored the gas and drove out of there, not stopping until I was miles away. I left a quick message for my boss, telling him I wouldn't be coming back, and turned off my phone. Weeks went by, and I tried to forget, telling myself it was just a trick of the dark, a result of too many nights alone. But last week, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid photo, taken from outside one of the cabin windows. In the picture, there was a figure sitting by the fireplace, me frozen, staring at something just outside the frame. On the back was a handwritten note in tight, cramped letters. "You left something behind." Now, every night I dream of that cabin. I dream of the tall figure, its face pressed against the window, staring, waiting for me to return. And sometimes when I wake up, I hear that faint tapping on my own window, like something has followed me, like something is still waiting just outside. It was supposed to be a quiet night in. My apartment was cozy, the kind of place that felt like a safe, private little corner of the world. I had a cup of tea, a stack of old horror movies to watch, and had just settled into my couch when the intercom buzzed. It startled me. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I thought it might be a mistake or maybe a delivery meant for one of my neighbors, so I ignored it. But a few minutes later, it buzzed again, a long, insistent sound that made my skin prickle. I walked over to the intercom, hesitated, then pressed the button. "Hello!" There was silence on the other end, but I could hear faint breathing, slow and steady. "Hello!" I said again, a little louder. Finally, a voice crackled through, low and soft. "Can you let me in? I'm here for you." I froze. No one I knew would say something like that, and certainly not at this hour. I cleared my throat, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think you have the wrong apartment." There was a pause. Then the voice replied, "No, I don't." A chill ran down my spine. I released the button and backed away from the intercom, the silence pressing in around me. I waited, hoping he'd leave, But after a few minutes, the buzzer went off again, even longer this time, filling my apartment with a grating, unnatural sound that felt like it was scratching at my nerves. I decided to ignore it. I turned up the volume on my TV, telling myself it was just some stranger trying to mess with me. But when the buzzing finally stopped, I thought I heard something even stranger, a soft scraping, like someone was dragging something along the outside wall. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, with no fire escape or ladder access, so the sound didn't make sense. But as I strained to listen, it grew louder, shifting to a rhythmic tap, tap, tap against my window. Slowly, I turned to look. The curtains were drawn, and for a moment I thought I could see a faint outline behind them, like the shadow of a figure pressed against the glass. I held my breath, feeling rooted to the spot. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow moved away, leaving me staring at the blank curtain. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something pressing close against the thin walls of my safe space. I thought about calling someone, but it was late, and I didn't know how to explain what had just happened. A stranger buzzing my apartment and a faint shadow? It sounded ridiculous. The rest of the night passed in silence. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch, clutching a kitchen knife, jumping at every little sound. When the sun finally rose, I felt a wave of relief. Whatever it was over. Or so I thought. The next night it happened again. I was brushing my teeth, winding down from the day, when I heard the buzzer. This time, I didn't answer. I just stood there, staring at the intercom as it buzzed again and again, relentless, as if daring me to respond. Finally, it stopped. But then, like clockwork, came the same scratching sound, slow and deliberate, moving up and down the wall outside. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building's security line, heart pounding as I waited for someone to answer. When the guard finally picked up, I stammered out what was happening, barely able to keep my voice steady. "Could you check the front of the building?" I asked. "There's someone outside my window, I think." The guard sounded irritated. "Miss, we've checked your building twice tonight already. No one's out there. It's probably just a tree branch in the wind." "There's no tree outside my window," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He paused, sighed, and promised he'd check again, but I could tell he didn't believe me. I waited, tense and shivering, but he never called back, and eventually, the buzzing and scratching stopped. I barely slept, jolting awake at every little noise, feeling like my apartment was closing in on me. For a few days, everything was quiet. I tried to move on, to tell myself it had all been in my head, that maybe I'd just been tired imagining things. But on the 4th night, I came home to find a small, white envelope tucked under my door. My name was written on the front, in perfect looping cursive. I stared at it, dread pooling in my stomach. Finally, with shaky hands, I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with 4 words, typed in the center of the page. "Do you feel watched?" My hands shook as I read the words again, trying to make sense of it. I checked the door, the locks, the windows, everything I could think of, but there was no sign of a break-in. I couldn't understand how someone had managed to get the note inside my building, inside my floor, without anyone seeing. That night, I left every light on, curled up in bed, gripping my phone like a lifeline. I started dialing my sister's number, ready to tell her everything, but a part of me hesitated. What would I even say? How would I explain that I was being harassed by someone I couldn't even identify? The next morning, I went to the landlord, demanding to know how someone could have slipped into my building, asking if there had been any maintenance workers or deliveries. He brushed me off, saying he'd look into it, but he clearly thought I was overreacting. "It's a safe building," he said. "We've never had any problems here." But after that, things got worse. Every night, without fail, the buzzing would start around 2 a.m. Sometimes it would last for a few minutes. Sometimes it would drag on for almost an hour, relentless and unsettling. I stopped answering the intercom, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that whoever was on the other end was just waiting, listening. And then the tapping started, not just on my window, but on the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Soft, deliberate taps that moved around my apartment, like someone tracing the edges of each room. Sometimes it sounded as though it was coming from inside the walls, like a creature trying to claw its way out. I tried to record it, to prove it was real, but every time I hit record, the noise would stop, leaving nothing but silence. One night, as I lay in bed with my heart racing, I heard a voice, faint and muffled, coming from the other side of my door. "Let me in," it whispered. "I just want to talk." I sat up, gripping the blankets, barely daring to breathe. "I know you're listening," the voice continued, a hint of amusement in its tone. "Don't you want to know who I am?" I closed my eyes, willing it to stop, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But the voice continued, coaxing, taunting, until it faded into a soft hum, like a lullaby, filling my apartment with an eerie calm. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up the next morning, I found a second envelope on the floor, just inside my door. I hadn't heard anyone come in, hadn't felt the door open. My hands were shaking as I picked it up and read the note inside. "You look so peaceful when you sleep." That was last night. I haven't slept since. I keep thinking I hear footsteps in the hallway, the faint sound of someone breathing just outside my door. I know he's out there, waiting, watching, but I don't know what he wants, or how he's getting inside, or how he seems to know everything about me. All I know is that I can't stay here anymore. This apartment, my safe little corner of the world, has become something dark and twisted, filled with a presence that feels more like a shadow, something that waits in the quiet spaces, biding its time. I've packed a bag, but I don't know if it will be enough. Last winter, I worked for a company that did third-party tech support for a lot of private clients. One of those clients was an eccentric millionaire who owned a massive estate on a small island off the coast. For privacy reasons, I'll call him Mr. Wakefield. He was a bit of a recluse, and from what I'd gathered, he lived alone. My job was supposed to be a one-time gig to troubleshoot some issues with his Wi-Fi network and security cameras. He sent a private boat to pick me up in town, and after an hour of choppy waves, I finally saw the island, a thickly wooded place with rocky cliffs and no beaches, almost as if the island didn't want anyone setting foot on it. The only sign of life was Mr. Wakefield's house, a sprawling Victorian mansion looming above the cliffs, surrounded by skeletal trees that looked like they hadn't seen leaves in decades. The wind howled as the boat docked, and I was met by Mr. Wakefield's assistant, a quiet, serious man who introduced himself as Elias. Elias led me through the front doors and into the main hall. The place looked as if it hadn't been touched since the 1800s, full of ornate furniture, high ceilings, and paintings of grim-faced ancestors who seemed to follow me with their eyes. Everything was neat, but eerily untouched, as if time itself had paused within those walls. Elias didn't say much, just directed me to the control room, where all the tech equipment was set up. The room was out of place in the mansion, a small, modern office with sleek computers and monitors showing various camera feeds from around the property. I set to work checking the systems, trying to ignore the prickling sensation of being watched, and eventually got absorbed in my task. Around an hour in, Elias appeared behind me, startling me with his sudden presence. "Mr. Wakefield asks that you finish by nightfall," he said in that quiet, almost monotone voice. "He doesn't like guests after dark." I wanted to ask why, but he was gone as suddenly as he'd appeared. The only hint of life in the mansion was the low hum of the heaters and the occasional pop and groan of old wood settling. I got back to work, figuring I'd be able to wrap up in a couple of hours. But then I started noticing something odd on the camera feeds. One of the monitors showed the east side of the island, a rocky, windswept cliff facing the ocean. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but I saw it clearly on the screen, something moving among the rocks. I zoomed in, trying to get a better look, and saw a pale, shadowy figure slowly walking along the cliffside. It was hard to tell with the grainy feed, but it looked like a woman. Her clothes were flowing in the wind, and her movements were oddly stiff, almost robotic. She stopped and turned, looking directly at the camera, and my heart skipped. Even though the image was blurry, I could tell there was something wrong with her face, something hollow, blank. I looked away for just a second, and when I glanced back, the figure was gone. I shook it off as an issue with the feed, maybe some glitch or artifact, and continued working. But a few minutes later, the screen flickered, and the same woman appeared again, this time in a different part of the property, the wooded area just behind the mansion. The camera feed was clearer, and I could see her face more distinctly now. It was pale, almost gray, with deep shadows where her eyes should have been. She was staring, not at the camera this time, but directly at the mansion. Her mouth opened, as if she were screaming, but there was no sound. I pushed back from the monitor, feeling a rising sense of unease. I dealt with security cameras and tech glitches before, but nothing like this. I decided I'd ask Elias about it before I left, maybe figure out if it was some kind of local prank or interference. As night began to fall, I wrapped up the last of the updates and left the control room to find Elias. The hallways felt colder, and the flickering light from the chandeliers cast strange, shifting shadows along the walls. I called out his name, but there was no answer. I wandered the darkening hallways, feeling that eerie sensation of being watched. Finally, I found him in a sitting room, standing by the window and looking out toward the cliffs. He didn't turn when I entered, just kept staring into the growing darkness outside. Elias, I wanted to ask about the cameras, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I saw a woman, I think, on the East Cliff side. Do you know who that is? Elias was silent for a moment before he finally replied, his voice lower than before. Mr. Wakefield doesn't like us to speak about her. About who? I pressed, glancing nervously over my shoulder. He looked at me, his face expressionless. There are certain things on this island, things that Mr. Wakefield believes it's best not to disturb. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to keep my composure. So, is this woman real? Is she a danger, or? Not to you, he said, his tone flat. But we all try to stay indoors after dark. For our own sake. That was all I needed to hear. I muttered something about finishing up and hurried back to the control room to gather my things. But as I reached for my bag, the monitors flickered again, and my eyes were drawn to the screen showing the East Cliffside. She was back. The woman was closer this time, almost at the edge of the property, her empty gaze fixed on the mansion. Her mouth was open wide, her expression one of anguish. But again, no sound came through. She lifted a hand, pointing directly at the camera, her finger trembling, and I swear I could feel her cold gaze even through the monitor. I backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet. Suddenly, the screen went black, every single monitor losing its feed simultaneously. The room plunged into darkness, leaving only the soft, rhythmic creak of the old house around me. Then I heard it, a soft, barely perceptible whisper coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was Elias, but the voice was too faint, too thin, like wind slipping through a crack. It was a woman's voice, whispering words I couldn't quite make out, repeating the same phrase over and over. I grabbed my bag and rushed out of the control room, my footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. As I reached the front entrance, I turned back one last time, only to see a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway, a tall, slender woman with hollow eyes and an outstretched hand. Her mouth was open, moving soundlessly, but her gaze was fixed on me with an intensity that sent me running out the door. Elias was waiting for me by the boat, his face pale. He didn't ask if I was all right, didn't even look at me. He just helped me onto the boat, and within minutes, we were speeding back to the mainland. The island grew smaller behind us, disappearing into the dark sea, but the image of that woman stayed with me, burned into my memory. When we docked, Elias finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. She comes back every winter. Sometimes we see her, sometimes we don't. But she always returns. Mr. Wakefield, he believes she's here because of something he did long ago. But he doesn't speak of it. He only warns us to never look directly at her, because once you see her, she doesn't let go. I didn't ask any more questions. I left that night, my mind buzzing with images of the woman and her empty gaze, her silent scream. I quit the job a week later and moved away, trying to put the whole thing behind me. But sometimes in the dead of winter, I'll hear a faint whisper, like wind slipping through a crack, and feel the same chill I felt that night. And I wonder if she ever really lets go. The truth came to me in pieces, like fragments of a dream. It didn't hit all at once, or even in one moment. Instead, it crept up, filling in the gaps over time, until I couldn't ignore it any longer. It began on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Eva and I were cooking together in the kitchen, bumping elbows as we tried to make spaghetti. She was teasing me about my lack of seasoning skills, laughing and playfully nudging me out of the way to add her chef's touch. We've been together for nearly 4 years, and moments like this were what made life feel real, like I had everything I needed right there in that small, cozy kitchen. But there was a slight edge to her laugh that night, a nervousness in her eyes that I couldn't quite place. She kept glancing at her phone, which she'd set on the counter, and when it buzzed, she'd sneak a look as though I wouldn't notice. By the time dinner was on the table, the air felt different. Heavy, almost like the calm before a storm. I didn't say anything, just watched her as she chatted about work, filling the silence with stories I barely registered. I chalked it up to stress, an off night, a feeling that would pass. A few days later, it happened again. We were out at a bar with some friends, and her phone buzzed twice, then 3 times. She glanced down, her smile fading, and quickly turned the screen away from me. I caught a glimpse of a name I didn't recognize, Jordan, before she slid it back in her bag and returned to laughing with everyone. That same unease rose up, clawing at me, but I pushed it down, convinced myself it was nothing. After all, I trusted her, didn't I? But then the little things started adding up. She'd come home late, blaming work emergencies that seemed to pop up with unusual frequency. And when she was home, she seemed distant, zoning out in the middle of conversations or keeping her responses short. I'd ask if she was okay, if something was bothering her, and she'd give me a tight smile, saying she was just tired. That word started to feel like a wall between us, a reason to avoid digging deeper. "I'm just tired," she'd say, and I'd leave it alone, even as the gnawing suspicion grew. One night, it became too much. She'd said she was going out with some work friends, and I told her to have a good time, but there was a weight in my chest that I couldn't shake. I tried to focus on my own plans, put on a movie, made myself a drink. But my eyes kept drifting to the clock, wondering if she'd come home early or if she'd be out late again. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from her saying, "Running late. Don't wait up." It was a simple message, but something about it felt off, like it was meant to keep me from asking questions. That's when I did something I'd never done before. I decided to go to the bar where she said she'd be. I didn't want to believe anything was wrong, but I couldn't let go of the feeling that something was slipping through my fingers. The bar was crowded, dimly lit with people huddled in small groups, laughter and music blending into a low hum. I scanned the room, searching for her, and then I saw her. She was sitting in a booth near the back, leaning close to someone, a guy I didn't recognize, who seemed too familiar with her, his hand on her shoulder as he whispered something that made her laugh. It was a different laugh, one I hadn't heard in a long time, full and unrestrained, like she was free in a way she hadn't been around me. I felt rooted to the spot, the world narrowing down to the two of them, completely oblivious to everything around them. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just watched as she leaned into him, their heads close, completely lost in their own world. It was like seeing her from the outside, a stranger who wore Eva's face, who smiled in ways she used to smile at me. When I finally turned and walked out, my mind was racing, filled with 1,000 questions and no answers. I drove around for hours, the city lights blurring past as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. By the time I got home, she was already there, curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. She looked up as I walked in, giving me a tired smile. "Hey, how was your night?" she asked casually, as if she hadn't just shattered my entire world. I felt anger rising up, but I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I didn't know if I was ready for the truth, for the confirmation of what I'd seen with my own eyes. So I swallowed it down, gave her a weak smile, and mumbled something about an early morning at work. The days that followed were a blur. She kept up the act, going through our routines as if nothing had changed, but I could feel the cracks widening between us. She'd laugh at my jokes with a hint of distraction, her eyes flickering to her phone with that same nervous energy. And I just waited, holding on to the faint hope that she'd confess, that she'd explain everything and we'd somehow make it right. Finally, one night, I couldn't take it anymore. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her face lit by the soft glow of her phone as she typed furiously, a faint smile on her lips. I walked over, pulled out a chair, and sat down across from her. She looked up surprised, her fingers freezing mid-text. "Eva," I said quietly, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Who's Jordan?" Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought I saw something like fear flash in her eyes. She set her phone down, letting out a shaky breath. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, she said, "I didn't want you to find out like this." She started to explain, saying that it had started as a friendship, a connection she hadn't expected, but that had somehow filled a part of her that had been missing. She spoke in halting, careful phrases, choosing her words like they were fragile things, easily broken. She told me she hadn't wanted to hurt me, that she hadn't known how to tell me the truth. But every word felt like a nail in the coffin of the life we'd built together, a life that was crumbling before my eyes. When she finished, I didn't have anything to say. I just sat there, staring at the table, feeling the weight of everything we'd lost pressing down on me. Eventually, she got up, leaving me alone in the silence, and a few minutes later, I heard the soft click of the front door as she left. The weeks that followed were surreal. I went through the motions, trying to piece together a new life out of the remnants of the one we'd shared. I packed up her things, moved them into boxes, each one feeling like a piece of her I was letting go. The apartment felt empty, haunted by the memory of her laugh, the warmth of her smile. I'd see her things and feel a pang of something raw and unnameable, a mixture of love and loss that I couldn't shake. One day, I found a photo of us tucked into an old book, a picture from our first trip together, both of us smiling, arms wrapped around each other, eyes bright with the promise of a future we'd never reach. I looked at that photo for a long time, feeling the ache of all the moments we'd never have, all the dreams that had faded before I even realized they were gone. But over time, the ache dulled. I started filling the empty spaces with new memories, new routines. I went for long walks, read books I'd always meant to read, took up cooking in earnest. I even started painting, filling the walls with colors that brought the apartment to life in ways it never had before. And slowly, the memory of her faded, becoming a part of my past instead of my present. I realized that I'd been holding onto an image of us, an illusion I'd created to keep from seeing the cracks. Letting go wasn't easy, but in the end it was freeing. I was ready to move forward, to leave the broken pieces behind and embrace whatever came next. The first time I noticed something was off, it was just after sunset. I was coming home from work, trying to get through my front door, but my key wouldn't fit. I pulled it out, checked to make sure it was the right one, then tried again, but it wouldn't turn. After a couple of frustrated jiggles, it finally slipped into place, and I got inside. The house was still, the air feeling thick and heavy, as if it had been waiting for me. I brushed it off, chalked it up to a long day. But as I walked into the living room, something struck me as strange. I noticed the small things first. My bookshelf, usually a chaotic mess, had the books lined up neatly like they'd been alphabetized. My coat was folded on the back of the couch instead of being tossed haphazardly over a chair. And my half-full coffee mug, which I'd left on the kitchen counter that morning, was empty and washed, sitting back in the cupboard. My stomach twisted, but I told myself it must have been me. Maybe I'd cleaned up in a rush without remembering, even though I'd never done that before. I shook it off, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The next morning, as I got ready for work, things felt even stranger. My usual path around the house, getting up, grabbing coffee, checking my emails, felt somehow reversed, like I was moving backward through my own life, hitting invisible bumps along the way. As I passed the hallway mirror, I felt a chill when I saw my own reflection. It looked fine, but somehow wrong, as if I'd been caught off guard with my expression frozen just a second too late. I told myself it was just my imagination, trying to shake off the growing sense of being watched. The day passed quietly enough, but that night when I got home, the air in the house felt even thicker, like stepping into a place that had been locked up for years. As I walked through the living room, I found an odd metallic glint on the couch, a key. I picked it up, examining it in the dim light. It looked exactly like my house key, down to the last scratch. But the more I looked, the more I felt certain it wasn't mine. It was heavier, colder. I tried to set it down, but something in me told me to keep it. I slipped it into my pocket, feeling its cold weight against my leg. Over the next few days, things only got worse. At night, I'd hear faint sounds in the house, footsteps, like someone pacing slowly in the hallway. Doors would creak open or shut when I knew I'd left them closed. I'd find my clothes arranged in neat piles, my shoes lined up perfectly by the front door. And every night, that key would somehow end up in a new place, a drawer, the edge of my sink, even in my bed once, lying next to me like it belonged there. I started feeling like a stranger in my own home, like it wasn't really mine anymore. One night, after another long day, I came home to find a single light on in the hallway. It was strange because I never left lights on, but I ignored it, too tired to care. As I headed toward my room, though, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks, a voice. It was faint, just barely audible, but I could make out the tone, low and calm, speaking as though it were in the next room. I strained to listen, feeling a cold sweat break out on my skin. The words were hard to make out, but I could hear my name. It was saying my name over and over, as though calling me, waiting for me to come closer. My heart hammered in my chest, and every instinct told me to turn around, to leave the house. But something in me, some deep, irrational part, wanted to follow it. I crept down the hallway, feeling the walls close in around me, the air turning colder with each step. The voice grew louder, clearer, like it was just on the other side of my bedroom door. I stopped, hands shaking as I reached for the handle, unsure of what I was going to find. Just as my fingers brushed the doorknob, the voice stopped, cutting off mid-sentence, leaving nothing but a heavy silence. With a sinking feeling, I opened the door. The room was empty, as it should be, but something felt occupied, as if I were intruding. And then I noticed it, a faint outline on the bed, like someone had been lying there, an impression on the pillow and sheets that didn't belong to me. My heart pounded as I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on me the entire time. I spent that night in the living room, curled up on the couch, every light in the house on, the strange key resting in my hand. I held it like a lifeline, feeling its cold weight, wondering who or what it belonged to. Finally, just before dawn, I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up, my phone was buzzing with a notification. It was a calendar alert I didn't remember setting. I opened it, squinting at the screen, and felt my blood run cold. Meet at home. Tonight. I stared at the words, a sick feeling twisting in my gut. Who had set this? I hadn't put it in my calendar. It felt more like a warning than an invitation, but I couldn't ignore it. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't focus, couldn't eat, just sat there, staring at that message, feeling the hours tick by as evening crept closer. By the time the sun started setting, I was a wreck, half convinced I was losing my mind. I paced the house, checking every room, trying to prepare for whatever was coming. As the last light faded, I heard it, the slow, steady sound of footsteps coming from the hallway, moving closer. I froze, gripping the strange key so tightly it dug into my skin. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room, and for a long, agonizing moment, there was silence. Then I heard the handle of the front door turn slowly, as if someone were testing it. I backed up, feeling my breath quicken as the door swung open. I expected something, but the hallway was empty, the door opening onto nothing but darkness. My hand shook as I reached out, peering through the door, looking down the dim, empty street. And that's when I saw it. There, standing at the edge of my driveway, was me, another me, staring back with an expression that mirrored my own, except for the eyes. My own eyes, but somehow sharper, colder, almost eager. It tilted its head, just slightly, as if to study me, and then it lifted a hand, holding a small, heavy object between its fingers. It was my key, the real one, the one I'd lost. It gave me a small, almost friendly smile, then tossed the key onto the driveway, letting it land with a sharp clink against the pavement. And then, without a word, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I watched it go, feeling frozen, my heart pounding as I stepped outside, picked up my old key, feeling the cold metal press into my palm. When I looked back toward the street, the figure was gone. I don't know who or what that was, but ever since that night, I've had the unsettling feeling that something else is living in my house. I'll find the lights turned on when I wake up, or my coat draped carefully over a chair, like it's waiting for me to come home. Sometimes I'll hear footsteps in the hallway, steady and familiar, and I'll catch a glimpse of something in the mirror, a shadow that looks just like me, but with eyes that don't belong. And every night I find the same message on my phone, a reminder that appears without warning at the same time. Meet at home, tonight. I don't know if I'm still the real me, or if the real me is still out there, waiting for the right moment to come back inside. But every night, I check the locks, and every morning, I find the door unlocked, as if inviting it in. And I wonder if someday I'll be the one waiting on the other side. About a year ago, I took on a new job working nights at a 24-hour convenience store in a small town just off the interstate. It was a sleepy place, the kind of town where everyone knew each other, and the most exciting thing that ever happened was maybe a minor fender bender on Main Street. The store itself was a bit run down, with flickering lights and a bell on the door that never seemed to ring quite right. My shift ran from midnight to 8 a.m., and it was almost always quiet. Just me, the hum of the fridges, and the occasional trucker stopping by for coffee and gas. One night, around 2 a.m., I was restocking shelves when I heard the bell over the door jingle. I looked up, expecting to see a tired traveler, but instead, a young girl stepped in. She couldn't have been more than 12 or 13, and she looked out of place. Her hair was tangled, and she wore a thin, oversized coat, even though it was a warm night. Her shoes looked too big, like maybe she'd taken them from someone else. "Hi there," I said, trying to sound casual. "You lost?" She didn't answer, just looked at me with wide, glassy eyes and gave a small shake of her head. There was something hollow about her stare, like she was looking through me instead of at me. She walked straight to the back of the store, where the cold drinks were, and stood in front of the fridges, staring at her own reflection in the glass. "Do you need help with something?" I asked, walking over. Again, she didn't answer, just stared into the glass as if mesmerized. Feeling a bit unnerved, I went back to the counter and kept an eye on her, glancing over every few minutes. She stayed like that for nearly 10 minutes, frozen, staring at the glass door. I considered calling someone, maybe the police or even child services. She seemed like she might need help, maybe a place to go. But just as I reached for my phone, the girl turned, gave me one last blank look, and walked out without a word. I followed her to the door, watching as she disappeared down the road, walking toward the outskirts of town. I debated calling someone anyway, but figured maybe she lived nearby and had just wandered out on her own. Kids do strange things sometimes. But then it happened again. 2 nights later, around the same time, 2 a.m., almost on the dot. The bell above the door jingled, and there she was again, wearing the same oversized coat and staring with that same glassy expression. This time, she didn't even look at me. She went straight to the back of the store and resumed her spot in front of the fridges, staring into the glass. The air felt colder, somehow, even though the store's AC wasn't on. I tried asking her questions, asking her if she was okay, if she needed anything, but she just stood there, silent as a statue. Finally, she turned and walked out, vanishing into the night the same way she had before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I asked around the next day, described her to a couple of regulars who knew everyone in town, but no one seemed to know anything about a girl like that. I even called the local police, but they hadn't received any missing person reports. It was as if she didn't exist. After that, I half expected to see her every night. I found myself glancing at the clock as it crept closer to 2 a.m., my heart racing a little every time the door jingled. A week passed with no sign of her, and I was starting to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe she was just a lost kid passing through. Then one night, the bell jingled again at exactly 2 a.m., and this time, I felt a strange chill the second I looked up. She was back, but something was different. Her face looked paler, almost gray, and her eyes had this blank, glassy look that made me feel like I was staring into the eyes of a doll. She walked, almost mechanically, to the back of the store, but instead of staring at her reflection, she turned and looked straight at me. "Have you seen my mother?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I froze, caught off guard by her question. "No, Who's your mother?" She tilted her head, still watching me with those empty eyes, and whispered, "She's lost just like me." A chill ran down my spine. I took a shaky breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean? Where is she?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached in her coat pocket and pulled out a small, tattered piece of paper. She held it out to me, her hand trembling slightly, and when I took it, her eyes flickered with something that almost looked like sadness. I looked down at the paper, expecting some kind of note or address, but all it had was a single sentence, scrawled in faded, childlike handwriting. "Find her before I do." When I looked back up, she was gone. Just like that, the store was empty, and the chill that had filled the air vanished. I rushed outside, looking up and down the road, but there was no sign of her. She'd disappeared, as if she'd never been there at all. I didn't sleep well after that. The note haunted me, the words looping in my mind. "Find her before I do." I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a warning in those words, something urgent, something I didn't fully understand. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to do some digging. I spent hours online, combing through old records and articles about the town, trying to find anything that might explain the strange girl's appearance. I almost gave up, but then I found it, an article from nearly 30 years ago about a young woman who had gone missing. She'd been last seen leaving her house late at night, supposedly heading to the store to pick up some things. Her daughter, only 12 at the time, had been the one to report her missing the next morning. The girl had claimed that her mother had been taken by something in the night, something only she could see. Authorities never found any trace of the mother, and the case went cold. But there was one detail in the article that made my blood run cold. The girl in the article had been described as wearing an oversized coat, one she'd been given by her mother. I felt sick, wondering if that could be the same girl who'd appeared in my store. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces fit too well. It was as if she was stuck, still searching, still lost, trapped in some loop that brought her back to the store every night, looking for her mother. Since then, I've seen her a few more times. She comes in around 2 a.m., her face growing paler with each visit, her eyes a little emptier. She doesn't speak to me anymore. She just stares at the back of the store, as if waiting for something or someone to appear. The last time she came in, I tried to give her the note back, but when I reached out, my hand went right through hers like she was made of mist. She looked at me one last time, her mouth moving silently, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. Then she turned and left, disappearing into the night. Now, every time I work the night shift, I dread the sound of that bell ringing at 2 a.m., half expecting her to come back. And every time, I wonder if she's still out there, searching, wandering, caught between this world and whatever's waiting on the other side. Last month, my office sent me on a week-long business trip to a small coastal town I'd never heard of. It was the kind of place that wasn't even on most maps, with a population that dwindled every winter as the tourists left and the cold winds swept in. The nearest hotel was an old Victorian house turned bed and breakfast on the edge of town, overlooking the sea. It looked like it hadn't been updated in 100 years, but it had a strange, worn charm to it that felt oddly inviting. Plus, it was only a short walk to the office, so I didn't have to rent a car. When I checked in, the woman at the front desk introduced herself as Lorna. She was small and quiet, with a thick accent that I couldn't place, and she gave me a long look before handing me the keys. "You're in room 9, she said, her voice low and deliberate. "The guest before you, well, he had to leave early. Just wasn't his cup of tea, I suppose." It struck me as a weird thing to say, but I shrugged it off and headed upstairs. The hallway was dimly lit, and the carpet was thin, faded with age. When I opened the door to room 9, it smelled faintly of seawater and something else, something old and dusty. The room was simple, just a bed, a small dresser, and a window that looked out over the town below. That night, as I settled into bed, I heard something strange, a soft creak like someone was pacing in the hallway just outside my door. The footsteps were slow and heavy, moving back and forth. I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. I assumed it was another guest, maybe just someone with insomnia, but the pacing didn't stop. It went on for hours, until I finally fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I mentioned it to Lorna in passing, joking about my noisy neighbors, but she just gave me a tight smile and shook her head. "We don't have any other guests right now," she said softly. "It's just you." I felt a chill run down my spine. I told myself she was just trying to mess with me, play into the spooky charm of the place. Still, that night, when the pacing started again, I locked my door and stuffed a towel against the crack at the bottom. The footsteps seemed to get closer, pausing just outside my door every now and then before continuing down the hallway. At one point, I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper, like someone was muttering just outside, but I couldn't make out any words. I lay there, heart pounding, until morning light seeped through the window, and the noises stopped. The next day, I tried to focus on work, but I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps, the feeling that something was just on the other side of that door. That evening, as I returned to the hotel, Lorna stopped me in the lobby. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice polite, but there was a strange intensity in her eyes. "Not really," I admitted, trying to keep my tone light. "Those footsteps again." Lorna's face seemed to pale a little. She hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening, even though we were alone. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "guests in room 9 hear things. Feel things. It's an old building, you know. A lot of history." "What kind of history?" I asked, trying to laugh it off. Lorna just gave me a cryptic smile. "You'll be fine," she said, "if you keep the windows closed." That night, I made sure every window was locked. I even checked twice. But sometime around midnight, I heard that slow creak of footsteps outside again. I held my breath, listening, feeling like whoever or whatever was out there was waiting for something. I was lying as still as possible when I heard the faintest click, like a window latch being lifted. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up slowly, my eyes darting to the window across from the bed. It was open, just a crack, even though I was certain I'd locked it before I went to bed. A cold draft slipped into the room, carrying that familiar smell of seawater and something sharp, like rust. I got up slowly, trying to ignore the prickling at the back of my neck, and crept over to the window. I pushed it closed and twisted the latch, but the moment my hand left it, it slid open again. I felt my stomach twist. I grabbed it with both hands, pulling it shut, and heard a soft whisper right by my ear, so close that I felt the breath against my skin. "Don't close it." I stumbled back, heart racing. There was no one in the room, nothing but the empty air, but I could still feel that whisper, the weight of someone's presence right behind me. I climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets up around me, and kept my eyes fixed on the window. I could still hear that voice, faintly, almost as if it was coming from outside, drifting in with the wind. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things and went down to the front desk, ready to check out early. Lorna was there, looking as calm as ever, though there was a glint of something almost satisfied in her eyes. "Leaving already?" she asked, her tone polite but somehow knowing. "Yes," I said, trying not to sound as rattled as I felt. "I need to get back to work." She nodded, her gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. "Well, take care, and don't worry about the room." As I was heading for the door, she called after me. "One last thing. Did you close the window?" I turned back, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Yes," I said slowly. "Why?" She shrugged, her eyes gleaming with something I couldn't place. "Good," she said softly. "Last time someone left it open, well, they didn't check out." I didn't respond. I walked out, trying to shake off her words, but they stuck with me. I drove back to the city, glad to leave that strange town behind. But a few days later, I received a small package in the mail. No return address, just a plain, unmarked envelope. Inside was an old, yellowed photograph. It showed a man standing by the open window in room 9, staring out into the night, his face half hidden in shadow. But the worst part? He looked exactly like me. On the back, in a familiar looping handwriting, were the words, "Welcome back anytime." That night, As I lay in my own bed, far from that town, I heard a soft creak in the hallway outside my apartment. It was supposed to be just another weekend trip to the lake, the kind we'd taken since I was a kid. But this time, everything felt different. Maybe it was the fact that my brother Sam was back from college, somehow quieter and harder to read, or that Mom hadn't stopped looking at her phone, scrolling through real estate listings, even though she said we were just browsing. I'd overheard her talking to Dad about selling the cabin, though he didn't know I'd been listening. Something about letting go and moving on, words I hadn't associated with a place that felt like a second home. We arrived late, the headlights cutting through the trees, casting shadows over the familiar worn path to the cabin door. The air was thick with the smell of pine and the faint, smoky tang from a nearby campfire. The place looked just the same as it always did. 2 stories with a chipped red door, the lantern on the porch flickering like it was as old as the trees around it. And somehow, I was already trying to memorize every detail, like it might vanish if I blinked. Inside, the cabin was just as I remembered, every inch of it filled with the past. There was the scratch on the dining table where Sam had carved his initials at age 10, and the small dent in the wall where my bike had collided with it one long ago summer. I'd loved this place like it was alive, like it was as much a part of our family as anyone else. I went to bed that night in the small attic room, listening to the sounds of the lake lapping against the shore, feeling the quiet that only existed out here, far from the noise of the city. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, replaying every summer we'd spent here. And though I told myself I didn't care, there was a part of me that felt like I was losing something I couldn't replace. In the morning, I was the first one up, slipping out before dawn. The sky was still a murky shade of gray, the sun just starting to peek over the horizon, casting a faint glow over the water. I walked down to the dock, the wood cool under my feet, and sat on the edge, letting my legs dangle, my toes skimming the surface. I didn't hear him approach, but a few minutes later, Sam sat down next to me, wordlessly handing me a mug of coffee. He hadn't changed out of his hoodie, and his hair was tousled, his expression softer than it had been since he came home. We didn't say anything for a while, just sat in the quiet. The only sounds the soft splash of fish breaking the water and the occasional call of a bird somewhere in the trees. Mom's serious about selling the place, isn't she? I finally asked, not looking at him. Sam sighed, staring out at the lake. Yeah, I think she's been serious for a while now. But why? My voice came out sharper than I meant it to. This place has been in the family for years. He shrugged, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. She says it's time to let it go. She thinks we're all too busy to come out here anymore. And maybe she's right. It's just different now. I wanted to argue, to tell him that it didn't matter if things were different, that some places were supposed to stay the same. But looking at him, at the way he sat so still, I knew he understood. He felt it too, the ache of letting go of something that had been woven into the fabric of who we were. Let's take the canoe out, he said suddenly, standing up and offering me a hand. One last time, just us. I looked at him surprised. We hadn't gone out on the lake together in years, not since we were kids, back when we'd race each other to the small island in the center and pretend it was some uncharted land. But now, something about the idea felt right, like a quiet farewell that only we could share. We paddled out in silence, the water calm and glassy, reflecting the sky as it shifted from gray to a soft pink. The trees along the shore blurred in the early morning light, everything bathed in a soft, hazy glow. I could feel the weight of the paddle in my hands, the steady rhythm of Sam's strokes beside me, the quiet intimacy of 2 people moving together without words. Halfway to the island, Sam stopped paddling, letting the canoe drift. He turned to me, a small smile tugging at his lips. Remember that time we tried to camp on the island and nearly got eaten alive by mosquitoes? I laughed, the memory coming back in a rush. We lasted, what, an hour? And you swore you saw a bear in the bushes. He grinned, rolling his eyes. It was definitely a bear, or a very large raccoon. We both laughed, the sound carrying out over the water, filling the space between us with a kind of warmth that I hadn't realized I'd missed. In that moment, everything felt exactly as it should, as if time had folded in on itself, and we were just 2 kids again, playing explorers on the lake. As we neared the island, Sam pulled out a small glass jar from his pocket. I hadn't noticed it before, and he held it out to me, his expression serious. "What's this?" I asked, taking it from him. "Something to leave behind," he said softly. I thought, if we're really saying goodbye to this place, maybe we should leave a part of us here. Something to remind us of all the summers we spent here. Inside the jar was a single feather, a small, smooth stone, and a crumpled photograph of the two of us from years ago, standing on the dock, arms around each other, grinning with our hair wet and tangled from the lake. I recognized it immediately, one of the few photos we'd taken out here, tucked away in an album somewhere back home. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I looked at him, at the unspoken understanding that had always been there between us, even when we'd grown apart. Without saying a word, I leaned over the side of the canoe and carefully lowered the jar into the water, watching as it sank slowly, disappearing into the depths below. When it was gone, we sat there for a long time, neither of us moving, letting the quiet fill in the spaces that words couldn't reach. There was a heaviness in my chest, but it felt different now, like I'd made peace with the idea of leaving this place behind, carrying a piece of it with me wherever I went. Eventually, we paddled back, our movements slower, more deliberate, as if we were savoring each stroke, each ripple in the water. When we reached the dock, we pulled the canoe ashore, standing side by side, looking out at the lake one last time. Mom and Dad were waiting for us back at the cabin, their expressions a mix of relief and sadness. They didn't say anything, just nodded as if they understood. Maybe they did. That was the last time we ever went to the lake. The cabin was sold a few months later, and life moved on, carrying us with it, scattering us to different cities and different lives. But every once in a while, I'd find myself standing by a river or sitting by a pond, and I'd close my eyes, feeling the memory of that place settle over me, the weight of it both heavy and light, like the stillness of a lake at dawn. And though we'd left it behind, I knew a part of me would always be out there, somewhere beneath the water, kept safe in a glass jar, resting quietly in the heart of the lake, waiting for us to come home. I'd always been a night owl. There was something comforting about the late-night quiet, when the world had gone dark and the sounds of the city had softened into a low hum. So, one night around 2 a.m., when I couldn't sleep, I decided to go for a drive. It was something I did every now and then, just get in the car, no destination, cruising through the quiet streets until I felt tired enough to head home. But that night, I decided to try a different route, taking a long, winding road that led out of town. The kind of road that seemed to go on forever, cutting through empty fields and dense trees, lit only by my headlights. I was about 15 minutes down the road when I saw the hitchhiker. He was standing just off the shoulder, his thumb out, a small backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked to be in his late 20s, wearing a faded green jacket and a wool hat pulled down low. I rarely picked up hitchhikers, common sense and all that, but there was something about him that didn't feel dangerous. He looked tired, worn out, and there was a desperation in his posture, like he'd been waiting for hours. I slowed down and pulled over, rolling down the window slightly. "Where you headed?" He leaned down to look at me, his face obscured by the shadows. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Just up the road, if you're going that way." It seemed harmless enough, so I unlocked the passenger door. He got in, settling into the seat, and I noticed he had a scar on his cheek, faint but noticeable. I didn't ask about it, and he didn't offer. We drove in silence for a while, and he seemed content to stare out the window, watching the dark landscape slip by. After a few minutes, I tried to make small talk. "So, where exactly are you headed?" He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Just up the road," he said again, almost like he didn't know himself. I let it go, figuring maybe he'd open up once he felt more comfortable. The quiet stretched between us, broken only by the hum of the engine and the faint crackle of the radio. Every now and then, I'd glance over, but he kept his gaze fixed on the road ahead, never blinking, barely moving. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "Have you ever driven this road before?" I shook my head. "No, actually. Just trying something new tonight." He nodded slowly, almost to himself. "It's an old road. People used to travel it all the time, back before the highways. They say it has a memory of its own." I chuckled, feeling a bit uneasy at his tone. A memory? Yeah. He looked out the window, his voice barely above a whisper. Some people who take this road never make it to where they're going. They just vanish. I try to laugh it off. Well, thanks for the comforting road trip story. He didn't smile. His face was blank, and I could feel his gaze lingering on me, like he was sizing me up. I tried to ignore the chill creeping up my spine, focusing on the road ahead. Ever hear of the phantom passenger? He asked suddenly. I shot him a sidelong glance. The what? They say there's someone who walks this road at night, he continued, his voice low and distant. Someone who never made it to where he was going. A ghost looking for a ride. And if you pick him up, he trailed off, his eyes unfocused, like he was caught in some distant memory. The air in the car felt thicker, colder, pressing in around me. I shook my head, forcing a smile. Sounds like a story to keep people on the highways. But he didn't respond, just stared out the windshield, his face set and unreadable. We fell back into silence, the road stretching out endlessly ahead. The night felt darker somehow, the trees on either side of us looming, as if they were leaning in to listen. After a while, I noticed something strange. The landmarks, the curve of the road, a twisted tree, an old, rusted mailbox. They started to repeat. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but after passing the same broken-down fence for the third time, I knew something was wrong. I glanced over at him, but he didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he didn't care. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, unblinking. Didn't we just pass that fence? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded slowly, almost absently. This road has a way of looping back on itself. A shiver ran down my spine, and I gripped the wheel tighter. You're saying we're stuck? He looked at me then, his eyes dark and empty. Depends on what you believe. I felt a chill creep up my neck, but I forced myself to stay calm. I don't understand. How do we get out? He leaned back, closing his eyes, as if he hadn't heard me. I wanted to shake him, to demand answers, but the fear in my gut held me back. Something about him felt wrong, like he was there and not there, a shadow in my passenger seat. Then, as if on cue, he spoke. There's only one way off this road. I waited, dread coiling in my stomach. And now what's that? His voice was barely a whisper. You have to remember. I frowned, glancing over at him. Remember what? But he didn't answer. He'd gone still again, his face blank, eyes fixed on the road ahead. I tried to press him, but he stayed silent, as if he'd drifted somewhere else, leaving only an empty shell beside me. The road continued on, unchanging, looping in a way that defied logic. I checked the time on the dashboard, and my heart skipped a beat. The clock hadn't moved. It was stuck at 2:47 a.m., the exact time I'd first picked him up. Panic clawed at my throat, and I fought to keep my breathing steady. Look, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. How do I get off this road? He turned to me, his eyes almost sorrowful. You don't remember, do you? Remember what? I snapped, my voice cracking with fear. He sighed, as though he were disappointed. The night you picked me up, the night we drove this road together, looking for a way out. I shook my head, not understanding. I've never met you before tonight. His gaze held mine, unwavering. Yes, you have. We've been here before. Over and over, driving this same stretch, trying to escape. His hand reached out, gripping my arm with a cold, iron grasp. But you always forget. Every time, you forget. I yanked my arm away, my mind reeling, struggling to make sense of his words. This is crazy. I'm not stuck here. I'm going to turn around and drive back. I turned the wheel sharply, making a U-turn, feeling a surge of relief as the car pointed back the way we'd come. But as I pressed the gas, the road in front of me twisted, curving back on itself. The same fence, the same twisted tree, the same rusted mailbox. The hitchhiker sighed, leaning back in his seat, as if he'd seen it all before. It's no use. You're stuck here, just like I am, until you remember. I pressed my foot harder on the gas, desperate to get away, but the road just looped, over and over, endless and unchanging. I was trapped, caught in some impossible loop with no way out. Then I looked at him again, really looked, and a flicker of something familiar flashed in my mind. His scar, the way he sat, the tired look in his eyes. It was like a memory just out of reach, something I should have known. "I know you, don't I?" I whispered, the realization dawning like a horrible truth. He nodded, his expression softening. "You've been driving this road a long time." The memory came back in fragments. Late-night drives, endless loops, and the same conversation. Over and over, a search for something we'd lost. I didn't understand it fully, but a part of me knew it was true. He looked at me, his eyes dark and hollow. "Are you ready to remember?" I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of it all, a heavy sadness that filled me. And when I opened them, the car was empty. The hitchhiker was gone, but the road was still there, stretching out in front of me, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that I'd be driving it forever, trying to remember something I could never quite reach. It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon when I first noticed her. I was out for my usual run along the river trail, a path that winds through a quiet part of town, shaded by tall trees and bordered by long stretches of tall, wild grass. I liked that trail. It was the kind of place where I could clear my mind, away from the noise and crowds of the city. But that day, as I rounded a bend, I saw a woman standing at the edge of the riverbank, half hidden by the trees. She wasn't dressed for the trail, no workout clothes or sneakers, just a long, dark coat that almost reached her ankles, her hair falling in loose waves. She was looking out at the water, so still and unmoving that I thought she was part of the scenery at first. I tried not to stare, assuming she'd wandered over from one of the nearby neighborhoods. But as I passed, I felt her eyes shift toward me, that subtle prickling sensation you get when someone's gaze is burning into the back of your head. I glanced back out of reflex, and that's when I saw her face. Her eyes were too wide, too focused, as if she were surprised to see me. Her lips slightly parted in a silent expression I couldn't read. She didn't wave, didn't say anything, just watched, her gaze tracking me as I jogged away. By the time I turned another corner, she'd faded from my mind, her strange presence lost in the rhythm of my run. But the next day, she was there again. Same place, same dark coat, the same intense stare that made me feel like she was trying to memorize me. I slowed down, curiosity getting the best of me, and offered a small nod as I passed. She didn't react, didn't even blink, just kept her eyes locked on mine until I was out of sight. I tried to shake it off, telling myself she was probably one of those people who'd found some peace in nature, maybe even had a favorite spot by the river like I did. But there was something too focused, too present about her stare, as if she was trying to send me a message without saying a word. The following weekend, I was out for a late afternoon run, trying to catch the last bit of daylight before the sun dipped below the trees. As I rounded the familiar bend, I felt a shiver run down my spine, a sudden awareness prickling at the edge of my mind. There she was again, standing in her usual spot, her face partially obscured by the shadows. Only this time, she wasn't alone. A child stood beside her, a little boy, no older than 4 or 5, holding her hand. The woman looked at me, but her expression was different now, almost accusing. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin, pale line. The little boy looked at me too, his face blank, a small doll clutched tightly in his other hand. This time I stopped. Something about the way they stood there, side by side, so still and silent, felt deeply wrong. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice sounding strange in the heavy quiet. The woman tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing further. "Are you?" she asked, her voice soft and toneless, like she was repeating a question she didn't understand. The way she said it made me uncomfortable. I muttered something about getting home before dark and started jogging away, resisting the urge to look back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that their eyes were still on me, following me, tracing every step I took. After that, I avoided the trail for a few days, trying to focus on work, on anything that would keep my mind off the woman and her strange, silent presence by the river. But that weekend, a kind of uneasy curiosity got the better of me. I convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that she was probably just a local eccentric with a penchant for people watching. So, I went back. The trail was quiet, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the light breeze. As I rounded the bend, My eyes automatically flicked toward her usual spot by the river. But this time, she was closer. She was standing right on the edge of the trail, as if she'd been waiting for me. Her coat was gone, and her hair was tangled, wild, falling over her shoulders. The little boy was gone too. I slowed down, feeling a mixture of fear and embarrassment for letting her unnerve me so much. But before I could say anything, she spoke. "You know, you really shouldn't have come back." Her voice was soft, almost kind, but her expression was anything but friendly. I forced a laugh, trying to mask my discomfort. "I wasn't sure if you lived around here or something. I kept seeing you on the trail." She stared at me for a long moment, as if measuring her words. "I don't live anywhere." The way she said it was unsettling, like she truly believed it. And for a moment, I wondered if I was talking to a ghost or something close to one. "Do you need help?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop myself. Her lips twitched into a faint smile. "It's not me who needs help." I felt a chill run down my spine, the kind that digs deep and stays with you. Before I could say anything else, she turned and walked back toward the riverbank, vanishing into the tall grass until there was no trace of her left. I left the trail quickly, feeling shaken, as if I'd stepped into someone else's story, something dark and unfinished. That night, I lay awake, replaying our conversation, trying to understand who she was, what she wanted. But there were no answers, only questions, and a gnawing sense of dread that grew every time I closed my eyes. The next few days, I took different routes, went out at different times, did everything I could to avoid that part of town. But no matter where I ran, I started seeing her. Once, she was standing at the edge of a crosswalk as I waited for the light to change, her dark eyes fixed on mine, unblinking. Another time, I saw her reflected in a shop window as I passed by, her figure barely visible, her hand raised in a slow, eerie wave. She never got closer, never spoke again, but her presence became a constant, lingering shadow that followed me everywhere. I began waking up in the middle of the night, convinced I'd hear her voice whispering softly outside my window, though there was never anyone there. Then, one evening, I found another figure standing in the park where I'd first seen her. This time it was the little boy. He was standing by the river, alone, his back to me. The doll he'd been clutching before lay on the ground beside him, half buried in the grass. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, as if he hadn't heard me. I took a step closer, a terrible sense of unease building inside me, but then I stopped. Something told me I shouldn't get any closer. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint voice, so soft it could have been the wind, whisper, "You shouldn't have come back." I ran, my heart pounding, my mind racing with 100 questions and no answers. I didn't stop until I was home, locking the door behind me, my hands trembling. I told myself it was over, that whatever strange, twisted thing I'd stepped in would stay behind on that trail, far from my life. But now, even in the comfort of my own apartment, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, somewhere close, watching. Every time I pass a dark window, I see her reflection, her eyes following me, her gaze full of something ancient and knowing. And the worst part is, I can't shake her words. "You shouldn't have come back." Like it was a warning, one I didn't heed. I don't know who she is or what she wanted, but I have the terrible, unshakable feeling that she hasn't finished with me. Last fall, I took a job working as an overnight cleaner for a funeral home. It wasn't exactly a dream job, but it paid decently, and I needed the money. The place itself was small, quiet, and the kind of old-fashioned that feels like it hasn't changed in 50 years. The funeral home director was an older guy named Jim, who explained the job in quick, mechanical terms, like he'd given the rundown 1,000 times. Clean the viewing rooms, vacuum the halls, and dust all the little knickknacks people brought in as memorials for loved ones. Jim mentioned one other thing before he left that night. "Don't go into the downstairs room," he said almost as an afterthought. "We keep the older records down there. They're fragile, so don't mess with them." He gave me a stern look and then left for the night. The first night passed without a hitch. I vacuumed, polished, did my rounds, and kept my headphones on to drown out the eerie quiet. But by the second night, I started feeling like the place was off. You know that sensation of being watched? I felt it the entire night, as if someone was standing just out of view, watching my every move. I kept brushing it off, chalking it up to nerves. I mean, it was a funeral home. I figured some lingering dread came with the territory. By the third night, the feeling got worse. I kept hearing faint sounds, like footsteps in empty rooms or a whisper coming from around corners. At one point, while I was vacuuming in one of the viewing rooms, I heard the distinct sound of something heavy sliding across the floor. I turned off the vacuum and strained my ears, but the noise had stopped. I checked the room, finding nothing out of place, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was there with me. Then came the fourth night, the night I made the mistake of going downstairs. I hadn't planned to, of course, but my curiosity was eating away at me. What was so special about this records room that Jim didn't want me near it? I convinced myself I'd just take a quick peek, maybe ease my own nerves by proving it was nothing more than a dusty storage room. The door to the basement was tucked away in a back hallway, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It was locked, but I'd seen Jim use a key from the keychain he'd left behind in the cleaning closet, so I grabbed it and let myself in. The air was cold as I stepped inside, and a strange, musty smell hit me immediately, like mildew mixed with something metallic. The staircase was narrow, steep, and felt like it went on for longer than it should have. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. The light was a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows along the concrete walls. Shelves lined the walls, filled with yellowing binders, faded photos, and stacks of what looked like old, handwritten records. It was exactly as Jim had described, just a place where they kept the history of the funeral home. But something felt wrong. The far side of the room had a small wooden door, half hidden by a stack of boxes. It wasn't locked, so I carefully moved the boxes aside and opened it, expecting to find more records or maybe even an old furnace. But what I found was stranger than anything I'd imagined. Beyond the door was a tiny, cramped room with walls covered in dozens of small, handwritten notes, each pinned up in neat rows. The notes were old, brittle, some of them nearly faded to nothing, and written in shaky, hurried handwriting. Each one had a name, a date, and a short message, almost like a diary entry. James R., January 3rd, 1971. I saw her again in the hallway. She was waiting. Marjorie W., March 18th, 1982. I heard them calling my name from the basement. Daniel C., October 7th, 1990. It's getting closer. I don't know how much longer I can keep it out. My skin prickled as I read each note. It was like these were confessions or warnings left behind by previous employees or maybe even visitors. I didn't understand what they were, but the notes felt desperate, urgent, like each person had seen or felt something they couldn't explain. And then I found one note that sent a chill through my entire body. It was newer, written in the same shaky handwriting, but with a date that was only a month old. Jim T., September 10th, 2023. It's still here, and it's watching. Don't stay after dark. I backed away, heart pounding, the gravity of the message sinking in. Jim knew something about this place, something he hadn't told me. I turned to leave, ready to forget the whole thing and pretend I'd never come down here when I heard it. A soft, scratching noise coming from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping over the walls, but there was nothing there. Just that flickering light, casting jittery shadows across the floor. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if something was scraping along the walls. I bolted for the stairs, stumbling up the steps two at a time. The scratching followed me, echoing in the narrow stairwell, growing louder with each step I took. By the time I reached the top, I could hear a low, guttural whisper, something that sounded like a distorted voice echoing from deep within the basement. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing hard, heart racing. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just an old building making noise, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me up those stairs. I didn't go back to the funeral home after that night. I called Jim the next day, told him I was quitting. He didn't even ask why. He just sighed and said, "I understand." His voice sounded weary, almost relieved. A week later, I found myself going back, though not by choice. I was driving home late at night, passing by the funeral home, when something caught my eye. The lights were on, all of them, bright against the darkness, like a beacon. And standing in the window, I saw a figure. At first, I thought it was Jim, but as I slowed down, I realized the figure was wrong. Its head was tilted, unnaturally twisted to one side, and its hand was pressed against the glass, like it was reaching out or waiting for someone. I drove off, too scared to look back, and I haven't been by the funeral home since. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that scratching sound, faint but insistent, as if it's trying to get closer. And in my mind, I still see that note from Jim, the final warning I ignored. I think about that figure in the window sometimes, wondering if it was just a trick of the light, or if something really had followed me up from the basement. And I wonder how many more notes might be down there now, pinned to the wall, left behind by people like me, warning the next poor soul who steps into that place. Because whatever it was, it's still waiting. The night I met Peter was one of those brutal shifts at the diner where it's so quiet you start to wish a customer would walk in just to break the silence. It was past midnight, and I was trying not to fall asleep at the counter, staring out into the dark parking lot. The place was mostly empty, just the hum of the neon lights outside casting an eerie glow over the booths and the faint whir of the coffee machine. He walked in around 1 a.m., just when I decided no one was coming in. I didn't hear the door open, just glanced up, and suddenly, there he was, already seated at a booth in the corner. He had this unsettling presence, the kind that instantly makes you wary, though I couldn't quite say why. He was dressed in an old, tattered coat and a flat cap pulled low over his face, his hands folded on the table in a strangely formal way. "Coffee, please," he said without looking up. I poured a cup and brought it over, my footsteps sounding unusually loud in the empty space. When I set the coffee down, he finally looked up and I nearly jumped. His eyes were so flat, lifeless almost, but he smiled thinly and said, "You look like you could use some company tonight." It was a strange thing to say, but I laughed it off and went back to the counter, expecting him to sip his coffee and leave. But he didn't. He just sat there, staring out the window, almost like he was waiting for something. After about half an hour of this weird silence, he called me over again, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Take a break," he said. "I'll buy you a coffee." I glanced around. The place was empty, and I could use a few minutes off my feet. I sat down, and he smiled again, that same thin, unsettling smile. "Peter," he said, extending a hand. His handshake was ice cold, his grip a little too firm. "You look like the kind of person who's got a story to tell." "I'm just a server," I replied with a shrug, trying to ignore the strange prickle at the back of my neck. "Not much story there." "Oh, everyone has a story," he said, his voice soft. "Some just haven't lived theirs yet." Something about his words sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could respond, he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on mine. "What would you do if you could change something?" he asked, his voice low, almost hypnotic. "If you could go back, undo one choice, one regret, would you?" I felt this strange urge to laugh it off, but his stare held me. "I don't know," I said finally. "Depends on the choice, I guess." Peter leaned back, nodding slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. "Most people say that," he murmured. "They think they wouldn't change a thing, that they'd live with their mistakes. But everyone has at least one thing they'd erase if they could." I tried to steer the conversation in a different direction. "So, what about you, Peter? Any regrets?" He smiled again, this time with something almost like sadness. "Too many to count," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But the difference is, I got to see them all." There was something unsettling about the way he said it, like he was speaking from some distant place I couldn't reach. I didn't know how to respond, so I just sat there in the silence, feeling the weight of his words. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something that looked like an old pocket watch. He held it out, his eyes fixed on mine. "I want to give you something," he said. "A chance to go back. Just once. But you must be sure, because once you choose, there's no undoing it." I stared at the watch, a weird feeling creeping over me. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head, his eyes dark and endless. "Think about your life. All the little choices, all the missed moments. Think about what you'd do differently. And when you're ready, he placed the watch on the table, sliding it across to me. Just turn the dial, and you'll find yourself back at the moment you wish you could change. I laughed nervously, glancing around, half expecting someone to jump out and tell me this was all a prank. Is this some kind of joke? Peter's gaze didn't waver. Not a joke, he said softly. A gift, or a curse, depending on how you look at it. I stared at the watch, feeling a strange pull, like it was meant for me, like it had been waiting. My hand reached out before I even realized it, my fingers grazing the cool metal. And in that moment, I thought of something, a choice, a regret I'd buried years ago, one that still haunted me. The night of the accident. I was 16, driving my little brother home from a friend's house. I'd been careless, not paying attention, laughing at something he'd said. I didn't see the car until it was too late. He was gone before the ambulance even arrived, and I'd never forgiven myself. What happens if I do? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Peter's expression softened, almost sympathetic. Then you'll go back to that moment. But be warned, some things are meant to happen. You can change a choice, but you can't change fate. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the dial. My mind raced, thinking of all the times I'd wished I could go back, that I could somehow change what happened that night. And now, here was the chance I'd dreamed of right in front of me. Remember, Peter said, his voice cutting through my thoughts. Once you turn the dial, you'll be back there. You'll live it again. And the choice you make, it will ripple through your life. You may save him, but at what cost? My hands shook as I gripped the watch. I thought about my brother, his smile, his laughter, how I'd do anything, absolutely anything, to have him back. Without another word, I turned the dial. Everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the car. My hands were on the steering wheel, my brother beside me, laughing, just as he had that night. The road stretched out in front of us, the headlights illuminating the asphalt. I knew what was coming, knew the exact second it would happen. My heart pounded as I slowed down, watching the intersection carefully. And then, just as I'd expected, the other car appeared, speeding through the red light. But this time I was ready. I swerved, barely avoiding it, pulling to the side as my brother let out a yelp of surprise. We were safe. I'd done it. I'd saved him. But as I sat there, catching my breath, something felt wrong. My brother looked at me, his face pale, his expression blank. Why did you do that? He asked, his voice strange, hollow. I stared at him, confused. Do what? Change it, he whispered, his eyes darkening. I was meant to go. You weren't supposed to save me. A chill crept over me, and I looked around, realizing that everything seemed slightly off. The colors too muted, the air too still. My brother's face twisted into a sad, almost pitying smile. You broke something, he said softly, and now it's coming for you. I reached out, but he vanished, fading like smoke, leaving me alone in the car, the silence pressing in. When I opened my eyes again, I was back at the diner, the watch sitting on the counter in front of me, ticking backwards, each second echoing in the empty room. Peter was gone. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw him in the reflection, watching me with that same sad smile. The watch continued to tick, counting down, and I knew, somehow, that it was counting down to something. An ending, a price I hadn't understood when I'd made my choice. I'd gone back. I'd changed my fate. But now, fate was coming for me.